The story begins with the protagonist finishing the game, and the ending would soon start. Everything was over, but his eyes showed no joy, as he recalled 10 years ago. That world had become the stage of a game. Everyone turned into players and had to defeat monsters to survive. The missions were given by the game master, also known as GM. There were distant beings in the sky, called gods, and many of them watched the games. They sought to use their favorite players as their own avatars, and some participated personally in the game. As a result, the human race fell into decline. Now lying down and looking upward, he thought that game was trash. The ending credited with humanity's extinction. Could it have been any worse? He wondered. At least he wanted to get rid of those bastards. There was only one way to save himself and the human race from the end. It was to escape from that world through a hole in the sky. However, there was a rule in the game. Avatars of gods could not pass through it. The protagonist was a toy, someone's avatar. Would it be too much to imagine that God laughing in his face? He might also think he was looked at with pity, but not by that bastard. The protagonist was certain that God would absolve himself of blame. Thus, the protagonist achieved a bad ending. It would be a lonely world. He saw this in a notification. As he saw that message, he wondered, if that wasn't a bad ending, then what would be? With enough strength to grip his sword, he thought lonely world was a good description of his situation. The system congratulated him for completing all the missions alone. It was as he had imagined. Everything would end that way. Now he would risk ending alone along with the disappearing world. He closed his eyes, gripping his sword with both arms raised upward. As he was prepared to fight, a message arrived, one that sounded strange. He deeply wanted to know what it said, but the message informed him that since he completed it alone, the DLC store was open. He didn't know why a console store had appeared out of nowhere, but he scrolled past to see the other messages. He could buy products to help him play, using accumulated points. That flash of hope made him want to live. Jumping up and sitting down, he wanted to know what he could buy. Even though it was little, his eyes widened. It was a second chance package. He just didn't know if the gods were aware of that. Then he thought that if they knew, he wouldn't be left alone. But why had a feature like that appeared? Looking upward, he thought it was a wild card that could only be activated after completing everything. He even thought it might be a delusion. Even if it was, he was happy. There was nothing wrong with it. After all, it was the game and its crazy rules. Among everything, he was only certain of one thing. He could turn that game upside down. What he needed was 1 million points to buy the package. Since the start of the game, he had accumulated a total of 1.7 million. Now he saw it was good that he saved until the end. With that, he bought the second chance package, and its benefits expanded. Messages popped up, recounting everything that had happened to him. During the second chance, he could buy various items from the store. Yet he was so tired of that reality that he couldn't tell if it was an illusion, a lie, or simply the truth. If there was a chance to change everything from the beginning and make a different ending possible, he would do it. A great luminosity surrounded his body, taking everything away. He let himself be taken, closing his eyes. The system asked him to try a new ending during the second chance. However, the game wished him good luck. With those words, the first round of the game ended. As if nothing had happened, he opened his eyes. He noticed he was sitting on a bench, surrounded by buildings and trees, wondering where he might be. He saw people, human beings like him, walking peacefully. His heart raced. He wasn't sure if he had really come back. He checked for the status window, but it still wasn't open. Enjoying the peace, he lay back on that bench. He didn't know how long he had been there. As he enjoyed his peace, a young woman with long black hair approached, asking what he was doing lying down. At that moment, he opened his eyes immediately, as he recognized that young woman, a close friend from high school. The way he stared at her with wide eyes made her wonder if there was something wrong with her face. He knew that, despite being younger, she was good at taking care of others. She always came to talk to him whenever she saw him alone. Remembering that, he sat up on the bench and said it was nothing. He thought they were quite close, and she had always been polite. It continued like this until the end. He said he was tired from gaming all night. She replied that if he continued that way, his grades this semester would be terrible. He knew the semester wouldn't start anyway, but he wanted to ask her what day it was. Finding it odd that he couldn't remember, she told him it was August 17th. That reality made him bow his head. He already knew what would happen next. Now his expression was completely serious, as he'd been told he'd be sent back to the start of the game. They really sent him to the exact day it all began, without even giving him a chance to change things beforehand. The girl wanted to know why her friend was acting weird. She thought maybe he hadn't fully woken up yet. With a tired look, he said that maybe he really hadn't woken up, thinking he had spent the night playing a deadly game. The girl sighed, ready to give him a good lecture. With that, he realized he truly was back. Even while listening to her lecture, he tried to remain as calm as possible around her. He was grateful to her for many things beyond her concern for him. After talking for a while, she asked if he wanted to go somewhere else. Not understanding her motive, he asked why she suddenly wanted to leave. From afar, he saw the guy who had flirted with his friend without caring about his presence. The girl, thinking it would be awkward for the two of them to remain in the same place, asked him not to stand up because of her. When he said there was no reason for that, she simply couldn't understand, as the two disliked each other. The problem was, for her, it had happened just the previous day, but for him, it had been so long he no longer cared. In his mind, 10 years had already passed. Suddenly, his eyes widened. He remembered they were having this kind of conversation when he heard screams in the distance. Monsters like goblins were invading the city, causing terror wherever they went. Initially, people thought they might be just kids in costumes. They even considered it might be a movie scene since it looked too animalistic to be real. That's when the girl called the protagonist to get closer to see what was happening. Since he already knew everything, he said he didn't want to. He preferred to remain there for a bit longer. He had made that exact mistake 10 years earlier, and this time, chose to wait. With tired eyes, visibly shaken by everything he had experienced, he asked her to wait just a little longer. Meanwhile, the crowd kept increasing. Everyone wanted to know what was happening, but then they noticed some people were being attacked. The goblins, aside from ugly, were monstrous and merciless creatures. Small, green, with pointed ears, and extremely treacherous, they left a trail wherever they went, and there they were already infesting the area. The girl, who had moved closer to better see what was happening, became startled. Desperate, people started fleeing after seeing those monsters appear, but that was the worst possible decision. The goblins had less strength than an average-sized adult, so they searched for weaker targets. In this case, turning one's back to a goblin was the same as asking to be treacherously attacked. Since people didn't realize this at the time, the goblins celebrated wildly, enjoying the hunt. They laughed while scaring and terrorizing innocent people. As expected, the protagonist wanted things to be different this time. She didn't understand what he was doing. It seemed he was going crazy, until she realized he'd done that to save her. The goblins were already close to them, but to the protagonist, they were now merely small crawling creatures. Unlike the previous time, when he'd been weak and ridiculed by them. At that moment, the girl placed herself in front of the protagonist, ready to face a goblin and save her friend's life. Now he remembered. During the first round, while he stood frozen in fear, she had stood in front of him. And he still remembered how the scene had turned another color because of what happened to her. 10 years ago, he had left Jisoo behind and fled like a damned loser. The system notified him that his second chance would soon begin. Before that, synchronization was starting. Now in that scenario, the protagonist was the only player who had already seen the end of the world once. Because of this, he was different from who he had been 10 years ago. This time, he was prepared for those damned goblins. Reacting appropriately, he launched himself forward and landed a cross punch on one of the monster's chin. With tremendous agility, the green creature was no match for the protagonist in a fair fight. Moreover, he showed an immense desire to make a difference. A message appeared, informing him that he had exterminated a first-stage goblin. With that, a new DLC became available. He received all remaining points from the first round. The messages were arriving one after another, including confirmation of synchronization. Now, whenever they completed a mission, everyone would earn points. With those points, they could increase their strength or even purchase items. These were basic rules of most games, and those rules also applied to that world, which had become a giant game board, and that was why the remaining 700,000 points from the first round had been spent on an item they shouldn't have bought, making him look like an RPG newbie. Light spread through the sky, and a voice announced that everyone had been invited to the Game of the Gods. The voice said that, from that moment forward, all of them would become players. People listened to that voice without knowing where it came from, but it declared that all main missions had to be completed. If they failed to complete a mission, they would receive a punishment. In this case, the goblins would appear again. They were informed that, for more details, they should consult the help system. People stared at the sky, where the voices originated, having no idea what they were talking about. The protagonist was already devising his strategy, since this was the Game of the Gods, and he couldn't suddenly boost his skills. If he did so, he would attract unwanted attention, as magical eyes were watching everywhere. The life of that citizen had suddenly turned into a reality show for the amusement of the gods, like a huge gaming arena, monitored at all times. That eye had a name. It was called Observer, and it was the eyes of the gods and the GM. They apparently could change form. He knew that, if he began to appear even slightly suspicious to the gods or the GM, the mission's difficulty would increase. He already knew that, in the future, the game would become harder. Therefore, the gods wouldn't allow anyone to escape easily. Holding one of the goblins by the hands, he thought he should avoid doing anything that might attract attention. He continued holding the goblin by the neck, lifting it and screaming to appear as if he were struggling. As he did that, his name was called. He turned around and sought his friend. She said it was difficult to understand, but she thought she knew a little about why those monsters had appeared. He tried explaining to his friend that, although it wasn't the reality they knew, it could very well be true. He told her that they saw messages and notifications in real life, but usually on certain devices. The difference now was that she was hearing them directly in her head. He even complimented her, saying she was very calm. She replied that because he had eliminated a monster so easily, she had calmed down. While they spoke, a mission was given to everyone. They had to escape from the college campus within 2 days. The voices said that, at that moment, countless goblins would attack everyone, and they should either run or eliminate them. People didn't even understand those messages, and the voices from the sky continued explaining that each player would receive different rewards. The protagonist, hearing that the difficulty had a 2-day time limit, commented that it would be too easy. The young woman said they would talk later. Now they had to run before those green monsters appeared again. Soon, the terrifying goblins were loose, causing chaos as always. They acted like unleashed dogs with no training. The young man dragged his friend to protect her while being chased by those small, mischievous green creatures. Despite being extremely ugly and short, the goblins created widespread chaos. Surprisingly, it seemed like only the couple was taking things seriously and running. Everyone else appeared to be in shock. While running, the girl glanced back with pity at those who stayed behind and were terribly attacked. Although they were completely stunned, this attack would serve as a reality check. Meanwhile, the pair continued running to avoid being easily caught by those pranksters. After running for some time, they found a place to hide. However, the young woman, panting, thought about the others. Her friend, the protagonist, tried to calm her down, saying there weren't many victims yet. He explained that if people gathered into groups, they could find temporary peace, at least until the hobgoblins arrived. Now he was digging into his memory, trying to recall where the safe zone was. However, suddenly, bright green letters appeared in the sky, indicating that the safe zone was right there. He remembered that during the first round, he had crawled desperately and luckily reached that place. Interrupting his thoughts, the young woman asked what exactly that area was. He explained that since it was a game, there should be areas where monsters couldn't enter, and that was one of them. No matter how much the monsters tried to break through that barrier, they simply weren't allowed to, and that made them furious. It was exactly as she had heard. Since they couldn't enter, they got upset and started leaving. Thrown on the ground, she understood and felt relieved to still be alive. Standing up, he looked down at her and said that for now, they could stay there, but the time would come when they'd have to leave again. She seemed to understand and agreed. He thought the first priority was properly equipping Jisoo before going out again, at least enough for her to defend herself against the goblins on her own. The late afternoon was already approaching, and people continued running, fighting for their lives in that insane game. Chasing behind them were those small green creatures, always seeking more mischief and fun. However, among the humans, there were some who stood out and managed to be even more mischievous than the goblins themselves. In the meantime, he had managed to equip his friend to the point where she could defend herself. Now she was ready to fight and was already defeating her first goblins. Some people passed by her, and one recognized her as Han Jisoo. Looking at that completely changed woman, he hardly recognized her. To better understand, let's go back 3 hours. The protagonist was telling her that for now, they could stay there, but soon they'd have to leave. She, breathing deeply and with a calm expression, said everything was fine. He looked at her and thought he needed to equip her. All the girls stood in the corner checking if there was any phone signal. The young man was observing every direction for the observers. There was only one reason for the gods to watch the players using observers. They found it extremely entertaining. They chose their favorite players and used them as their own avatars. Then all they had to do was watch their avatars complete the missions and sit back to enjoy themselves. But there was also another reason: the GM, known as Game Master. They managed the servers and sent out the missions. That was the personal observer of the Korean GM, Ekaters. When looking at that thing, the protagonist just hoped it would leave quickly. However, that eye seemed to be searching for something. To deceive the observer, the protagonist lay down. 30 minutes passed, and the observer left. The protagonist knew they didn't have much patience. After benefiting from the GM's lack of patience, he had to check the DLC store or consider another strategy. But when he glanced at the store and saw the intense brightness spreading out, he became afraid his friend might notice. He needed to act quickly before she realized it. There was a notice stating that Earth had been selected as the new RPG location. He found a browser. It was a community used by the gods, a free target report board. He quickly entered the chat room to see what was going on. He was Anonymous 48. The leader from Greece wanted to know who he was. Now the protagonist wondered if he should reveal his identity to them. He knew them. He spent quite some time observing other people's conversations. After a flood of chats and information that he merely received, he noticed they were talking about them. He thought he should periodically check that chat room to gather information. He decided to look at the community for now, but he was shocked. The quantity was insane. There were many treasures and rewards, some of which were locked main items. They would probably unlock as each mission was completed. There was something there he thought might be the most important, but it still hadn't been unlocked. He didn't even know if it belonged to the first round or not. nor did he know how to unlock it. There was no explanation. He was already close to the end of the first round. Now he wanted to see if there was anything special. He briefly considered ignoring the locked items. However, there was a player pack for someone who had completed the game solo in sync play. Now he was invited to play with friends. That cost 20,000 points. To him, it was a relief having 700,000 points. Normally, that would be a price he'd only dream of. Suddenly, he heard someone calling out, saying everyone should gather at a certain place. It was then that the protagonist realized people had already started grouping together. Motivational speeches had already begun, stating that if they banded together, they could handle the monsters. Some groups were forming out of necessity to survive. Now those playful goblins were having a harder time amusing themselves. Still, occasionally someone unaware was caught off guard by them. But they couldn't always rely on luck, as people were taking their fights seriously. They encouraged one another and protected each other, despite all of them being very afraid. The protagonist watched from afar as everything began to get organized. The girl wanted to know if they would stay there. He told her that they would move forward. She wanted to advance as quickly as possible, as she was starting to get hungry too. He always looked at her strangely, thinking she didn't worry much and rarely asked big questions. Before leaving, he needed to give her something and wanted her to take that pointed object she'd taken from a goblin. She became thoughtful. If he gave it to her, what would he use? He said he would just grab another from a goblin when one appeared. Observing his changed attitude, the girl felt that this Sahanapa wasn't the same person she once knew. He gave her another object. It was a VIP brooch that increased regeneration speed and point gains by up to 20%. Hanjisu was beginning to understand. She said it was an item and wanted to know where he had found it. He chose not to mention that it had dropped after defeating a goblin. He was satisfied enough that she now understood the concept of items. He looked at her, thinking that this tiny object had cost him 10,000 points. Adding his own, the total was 20,000 points. Watching her wear it, he thought that despite being expensive, considering its advantages, it was quite a bargain. Even though reality had become a game, death was still the end of the line, and considering this concept, 20,000 points to recover from wounds was worth it. The bonus increased point collection by 20%, which made it incredibly beneficial. A red alert sounded when they left the safe zone. There was a phrase common in item-based games. Carefully, the two left, but he reminded her that she should focus on defense. Meanwhile, the seated gods were having fun watching those things happen to humans. Some thought it was truly crazy how ridiculous humans were. The ones from his district were praying. Another god said the people from his own district were shooting everyone and going insane. They wanted to know what was happening in Ikater's territory. He explained that there was a guy in whom he had some expectations. He was from his district. He referred to the protagonist as Chien Sol Sinon. The protagonist checked if his friend was prepared, making sure he hadn't forgotten any essential equipment. Afterward, he asked if she felt ready. She replied yes. He said they would leave the protected area. She should remember to focus on defense. They were at a high spot from which they could clearly see the chaos below that the goblins were causing. While standing up there observing, the girl looked at the young man as if asking permission for something. After receiving permission, she jumped down to fight against those little green monsters, who tried at any cost to intimidate everyone with their screams. However, that heroine was prepared to follow the plan exactly as intended. Just as her friend explained, she should attract a large number of goblins, as one among them would be leading the others. He explained that their leader would be the mission's boss, and they couldn't get out of that situation unless they eliminated him. When the girl asked if he would defeat the boss alone, he looked at her and said he'd need her help. In the current situation, she was already attracting the attention of as many goblins as possible, especially since she was prepared, using a potion that attracted weak monsters called Perfume of Temptation. She was supposed to spray that potion to lure all the goblins to one side, and when it seemed like she was about to be captured, she would use another item. In this case, it was a vial containing an invisibility potion. That way, she could become invisible for 5 minutes. In their plan, she knew she had to act as bait, and her role was essential for the plan to succeed. When she saw some of them gathered, she felt it was time to use the potion. But suddenly, a crowd of people appeared, running away from the monsters. Those troublesome green creatures wanted, at any cost, to bite those humans. One of the girl's friends saw her from afar, recognized her, and began asking her for help. As she ran, the girl thought that, out of all bad situations, this was one of the worst. However, the protagonist had warned her that even though defeating the goblin leader was ideal, the mission was ultimately to escape. She remembered her friend's words and suddenly made a dramatic stop. Then she began running again toward the little monsters, as if she were going to catch them. When she did this, she felt her body becoming very light. The guy who recognized her could hardly believe it was really her. Listening to this questioning, she thought saving him hadn't been a good idea, as he was incapable of showing gratitude. The young man was too scared to recognize that he'd been saved. Suddenly, a dangerous situation arose as the girl's eyes widened. Suddenly, she felt her breathing become strange, and her body started trembling. She knew she didn't have much time left, and her body began shaking uncontrollably. As the goblins approached, she dropped the vial. There were many of them. They were heading toward the protagonist's direction. She simply had to stop them. Now her aura became strange, taking on a reddish hue, just like her eyes, and she was convinced she could stop them. Meanwhile, as he walked searching for the boss, he thought that the girl had been well trained and wouldn't have any problems. The protagonist stealthily approached, mocking the boss he hadn't seen in 10 years. But of course, the boss didn't remember him. To him, it was the first time seeing that human. He launched a small attack and noticed that the boss was unusually aggressive that day. He was about to warn him that if he continued like that, he'd have to take action, but first he distributed 20 points into agility. Doing so, his legs became stronger and more toned. Even the protagonist's posture had changed after receiving the 20 agility points. Compared to the goblin boss, the protagonist was insanely faster. This brought a slight smile to the young man's face as he attacked the stage boss. When he was already above, ready to strike, he punched downward onto the boss's head. He paused for a moment, observed the precise spot to hit, and then struck. This caused extreme pain to that goblin, who howled and growled angrily. However, he thought about how that goblin's sword had claimed many victims in the first round, but it wouldn't this time. Picking up a stone, he equipped his arm with another 10 points of strength and threw it with full force toward the goblin. He practically nailed that stone onto the goblin's head, who slowly collapsed onto the ground. A message quickly appeared, confirming he had eliminated the secret boss of that stage. He received rewards and extra points for it, greatly pleasing the protagonist. Since it was a secret boss, it was well deserved. He could obtain the Goblin Chief's belt, but it was an unlimited item, so it wasn't perfect. Checking its rank, he saw it was only rank F, thus without points. It was at its limit. He supposed it was because this was still just the first mission. He wanted to further increase his attributes and needed to do it quickly, as the gods would soon discover his achievement. As he walked, he found it strange that he hadn't seen his friend, much less the goblins. He knew that the invisibility potion's duration should have been 5 minutes. He considered that perhaps she hadn't managed to escape. Just as he thought he might have arrived too quickly, he saw only a few goblins passing by. They were being severely disciplined by someone he couldn't see. The terror was so great that the goblins were fleeing in fear. The protagonist didn't think it could be his friend. However, when he saw her passing like a flash, he noticed something had happened to her. He detected a mixture of scents, but there was definitely hostility mixed within. Since the beginning, he considered not leaving her alone. He wasn't willing to let her leave. Suddenly, the girl stopped, having already eliminated all the goblins that had appeared in her path. Minutes before the protagonist arrived, his friend, who seemed possessed, was easily eliminating several goblins. The girl had a look similar to those green monsters that made her as merciless as them. Someone who previously had no contact with those creatures was now enjoying herself the same way they did. After everything ended, and she had cleared the area previously infested by goblins, she stopped in a certain spot, and upon seeing her friend, called him by his full name. Observing the entire scene and the devastation of the green creatures, he could hardly believe it was the same girl. However, now his friend was slowly releasing her sword and crouching down. She seemed pleased to see he had returned safe and sound. However, in her mind, she hardly understood what had just happened. For the protagonist, it was difficult to let that go unnoticed, as he knew goblins were weak but numerous for just one person. With that doubt in mind, he asked her about the invisibility potion. She explained that she found a human while attracting the monsters. Then she pointed to the person, asking if he was Lee Jong-hun, and it seemed there was someone else as well. Both appeared to have suffered a difficult fate. However, the girl stated that both of them were fine when she first saw them. She said she thought they had merely fainted from fear of the goblins. He thought the boys had fainted upon seeing her. Something had happened to the girl, and he needed to find out what it was. Therefore, he suggested checking her status window. He asked her to accept his request. He noticed her strength was high, but didn't initially see anything unusual. However, suddenly, he noticed a status resembling the head of a demonic skeleton. That seemed new to him. Checking the status carefully, he realized it was a passive skill that could provide significant effects just by acquiring it. He had seen it once before. There was a being called Hyulma, who came from a world called Jin. At the time, he impressed the protagonist for being the strongest guy in his dimension, possessing a skill called Chien Sol Sinon. It was also known that the person who possessed that skill had a high chance of losing consciousness. His friend, however, hadn't yet shown any signs of that type of skill. He would need to take good care of her. Upon seeing the skill on her status, the girl asked what it was about. Hearing the question, he wasn't sure if he should explain or wait. He decided to share only the most important part at that moment. He started by saying that it was basically a complicated skill. While he tried to explain, the young woman thought the skill she possessed seemed somewhat strange. However, as she talked with the protagonist, her eyes gradually became reddish, simply due to him raising his sword and her seeing the green liquid left behind by the goblins. To comfort her, he said that having such a skill from the beginning was a great merit. As an experienced player, the protagonist knew some tricks. Therefore, he wanted the girl to form a contract with him. That request caught her off guard, as she had no idea what he was talking about. Seeing the young woman's confusion, he tried to explain it in an easy way. He said it wasn't anything weird, they would just do something simple. After he explained what it was, she mentioned that she had previously tried group hunting in a game before. Trying to understand the girl as best as possible, he showed her a green cube he had purchased. It was a skill-sharing package. If things went well, the protagonist could become even stronger than in his previous life. He was making a request to share her powers. He told her that a notification would arrive, and she just needed to accept it. With that gesture, he had now successfully gained the first member of his group. After that, he was asked if he wanted to share his skills with her. However, he didn't yet have anything worth sharing. It was then he realized he needed a strong and meaningful skill to share with her before they could exchange skills. He knew a perfect skill for her, but it would take some time to acquire. Therefore, he decided to leave the skill sharing for later. Attempting this, he knew those eyes were everywhere. He suggested to the girl that they continue and finish their mission. She still remembered that the mission was to escape. As they spoke, the two who had fainted woke up and remembered seeing her running. She said his reaction was better than that disgusting stare from earlier. The protagonist approached the guy, asking if he wasn't that clueless nerd. The two didn't like each other at all. While the man was being disrespectful, the young woman didn't like it one bit. She wasn't intimidated to show it either. She told him he should respond politely to what was asked. The young woman he once knew, gentle and adorable, had now definitely become a gladiator. The protagonist wanted to know why he was separated from the main group while most others had grouped up. The young man, stunned, replied that he wanted to explore the area. Therefore, everyone was doing that to warn of dangers. Since the protagonist wasn't foolish, he knew someone was ordering him to do these things. He knew there was no way someone would voluntarily become a scout. The young man, raising his hands, admitted that the protagonist was correct. He had merely been chosen through a lottery. After he said these words, a large building was shown, where a sort of competition seemed to be taking place. Someone was motivating a crowd, someone capable of uniting people during moments of panic. If someone possessed leadership abilities and superior intelligence, the protagonist wanted to go to that person. The guy became angry, claiming the protagonist was acting arrogant from the beginning. He demanded to know who he was to tell him what to do. While he was speaking, one of the little green creatures jumped toward him, wanting to test if his flesh tasted good. However, slightly mischievous, the protagonist squeezed the goblin's hand after it cried out a bit. The protagonist took pity on the young man and gave him an opportunity to redeem himself, thus revealing his furious eyes. After the act, some liquid splattered onto the face of the boy who thought he knew everything. After that act, the protagonist responded to the guy who had interesting information about goblins. As the protagonist spoke, the young man with the dirty face stared wide-eyed. And then when Appa made it clear that goblins targeted the weakest first and that it wasn't wise for him to walk around alone. With wide eyes, the protagonist stared at that young man, asking if he would stay alone or if he preferred to help. He knew what it was like because, in the past, he too had only thought about running away. He had been incredibly lucky to find the safe zone. Now he was beginning to doubt the path the young man was leading them on. It seemed strange. However, the young man said everyone had gathered in a gymnasium and was already ahead of them. From down there, they'd managed to visit someone doing rounds up above. The place seemed busy, with many people receiving first aid and being revived. It resembled a poorly organized hospital wing. The person in charge had gained the trust of many people. He thought there were few people at the university, or perhaps they didn't remember what was happening. It was the student president who had sent someone out for reconnaissance. The young man was startled when he realized the protagonist had discovered his identity and wanted to know how he knew. However, everything was quite obvious. The student president was someone charming and intelligent. He also possessed leadership skills, and there was no way he wouldn't attract people. He knew that person would be treated like a rare avatar. None of those people knew they were going to perish. He noticed several observers following that person. He should have received at least one avatar invitation. He knew that if he trusted the gods and became an avatar, he could obtain many benefits. He would need confidence. As the protagonist was pondering these things, the young man received more than 6 messages about avatar invitations. But when he looked down and saw that his comrade had returned, bringing 2 more people, he became interested. He was also happy that his friend had returned safely and was pleased to see Yeonjitsu. He wanted to know where they'd been. The young man said they could discuss that later. The crucial thing was for everyone to get out of there. The young man was startled by those words and wanted to know what he was talking about. Trying to remain calm, the protagonist explained that when the boss was eliminated, a system alert appeared. With that, the goblins entered a state of confusion, and they had to take advantage of that moment to escape. He thought it was difficult to remain discreet with everyone watching and explained that if he opened the status window, he'd notice the timer. When the young man did so, he said he hadn't even known there was a specific time. But there it was. Reality was different from when they first encountered it. It was as if someone were playing inside a game. The young man became upset, thinking the protagonist knew something and wasn't revealing it. The protagonist replied he didn't know anything, just that it was logical reasoning. Whoever it was wanted to watch the circus catch fire, especially since things had slowed down after the boss was eliminated and the number of people being discarded also decreased. Since that wasn't entertaining, the gods would quickly become bored. Therefore, the players shouldn't get comfortable. The gods likely already knew the boss had been eliminated. They'd need something new for entertainment. The student leader quickly understood what was being said. It was essential to finish the mission and escape. The young man agreed that they indeed needed to do something, as they couldn't contact anyone else. The young man's words unsettled the protagonist. He seemed to know what to do, yet had failed last time. In the previous round, nothing seemed to be happening in the gymnasium, but now everything felt different. Back then, everyone was slaughtered. That made the protagonist think the leader was either cowardly or indecisive. Seeing him personally, he realized he was neither. However, another person said the best thing to do was to wait. It was a delicate-looking young man with red hair who thought they should wait for rescue. In his mind, the protagonist called that man Bat Park, though he didn't know why he was there. He remembered that guy well. It was him who had made others sacrifice themselves several times in the previous life. Now the conversation was between the red-haired man and the student leader, who thought something quick needed to be done. However, the redhead was strange and used dirty tricks like emotional blackmail. He claimed that if any life was lost, it would be the leader's fault. This caused the student leader to doubt his own decision. The protagonist didn't remember that guy from his class, but now, seeing him personally, he understood what was happening. The red-haired young man, trying to appear friendly, greeted the protagonist, saying he was the student council vice president. Trying to reciprocate, the protagonist also greeted him. The redhead soon began speaking, mentioning that he had overheard him spewing some nonsense to the student president. The president raised an eyebrow and said he was crazy. Most people were injured. He continued questioning, suggesting they had eliminated 1 or 2 monsters out of sheer luck. He added that those creatures surpassed human understanding, and that it would be impossible to escape from there injured, even more so without any weapons. It would be better to keep waiting. Hearing such nonsense, the protagonist clenched his fists as hard as he could because he knew that was a common thought. The issue was that the protagonist already knew that the redhead was a psychopath who circulated among different groups. He spoke badly about leaders and disappeared after everyone else was eliminated. If it was for his own benefit, it didn't matter who had to die. He was like a demon wearing the mask of a human being. The protagonist told him his sweet talk was working. However, he thought that, this time, things wouldn't go the way the little bat wanted. The young woman, unable to bear such audacity, intervened and asked what exactly they had eliminated by luck. She wanted to know if he was even present when the monsters were torn apart. The guy became startled when she called the little green monsters goblins. She explained that their names appeared above their heads the moment they were eliminated. Mockingly, the guy asked if she was implying that she participated. The girl, with a harsh and firm tone, asked if he wanted her to give him a demonstration. She said it was naive to wait for rescue just because of a few goblins. She showed the phone screen, proving they couldn't even contact the army or any other survivors. With a strange look, he asked if she genuinely thought the others would accept that. Tired of the conversation and out of patience, the protagonist warned that all of them could stay and perish together. He admitted that he knew it would be hard to convince everyone to leave, but if they wanted to stay, that wouldn't be his problem. The protagonist spoke that way, but he knew that if it came to saving Little Bat Park, he wouldn't stay behind. It seemed to be working. The man was so angry that he ground his teeth. His intention was to massacre everyone and receive a reward based on how many people perished. The protagonist knew the risk of suspicion from outsiders would be greater than the reward he would gain. The student leader decided he'd leave with the protagonist, so the student vice president would also have to go. The protagonist and his friend, watching the two talking from afar, noticed that the young man was very familiar with the reward system. They knew that skinny little redhead was very intelligent and had probably already become someone's avatar. Some people asked the student leader if it was really safe to leave, as there were still many little green monsters around. The young man replied that according to people who had come from outside, the monsters didn't know what to do after their leader failed. An older man also caught the student leader's attention, finding it absurd to try and take all the people with him. By the way he spoke, He could only be a professor since he was threatening to lower their grades next semester. Under the gaze of many observers, they were trying to leave, and with a bit of order, everything would turn out fine. Jisoo wanted to know if it was really okay to leave that way. The young man said that, if nothing new happened, things would remain calm. He also explained that goblins who had lost their leader usually didn't attack people in groups. The protagonist's desire was simply to finish off that annoying little bat, but he couldn't do it right now. With a serious look, he thought there were many witnesses, and maybe he could use him later. The advice was for everyone to be careful with the goblins around. They were also informed that the goblins wouldn't attack if no one moved away from the group. The protagonist noticed the young man was doing exactly as he said, so he decided to leave the leadership role to him for now. They walked non-stop for a long time and saw a main gate, believing it was the exit. They felt happy, thinking everyone would survive. However, the protagonist paid attention to the system. He saw a notification warning that the mission difficulty would increase and the sentinel would soon appear. After that warning, everyone began feeling a strange tremor. When they looked up, they saw something that shocked them. A huge horned beast resembling a minotaur appeared. The enormous animal reacted through its sense of smell. With all that, the protagonist realized that the gods of this round were being reckless by releasing a minotaur in the first mission. Due to his extensive experience, he already knew that if it had been the goblin leader, even normal players could have defeated him as a group. But the sentinel was a common event in games, specifically designed to take down many players. However, even if the minotaur was a rank C monster, the sentinel's strength would have limits, since this was still the first mission. The minotaur had 100 strength with no dignity, along with magic and stamina. Now none of them knew what to do, not even the bossy little redhead. When he began throwing a tantrum, Jisoo gently placed her hand over his mouth to silence him. Due to his experience, the protagonist knew that if everyone started running, the minotaur would charge at them. Amazingly, a fearful young man suddenly appeared, running away and yelling for everyone else to do the same. The minotaur quickly noticed that person, who was running and screaming, triggering its senses. After seeing the huge beast, many became paralyzed by horror and fear. This happened after the minotaur roared, as its scream had a paralyzing effect. It was better this way since now none of them could flee, but the crafty one was still running. At one point, he looked back, and his eyes widened in shock. Doing exactly what the minotaur wanted, it chased him down. When it raised its hoof, it crushed the young man. Everyone who witnessed this trembled and went into shock. Everyone, including the protagonist, watched as another older man tried his luck by running as well. But the minotaur was the same, and his fate would be similar. He was crushed by the monstrous strength of the beast. Not much was left of that man, and everyone who saw it became even more terrified. However, Jisoo, the strongest girl there, just closed her eyes, trying to endure the foolishness of the people around her. The minotaur, seeing that people stopped trying to run, released an even louder roar. Those who looked at the monster knew it easily exceeded 5 meters. A monster capable of tearing people apart with one hand. People didn't understand why the difficulty had increased. They couldn't think of any way to escape. In fact, running was no longer a good idea. The student leader wanted to know what they would do now. That's when the protagonist announced someone needed to distract the beast. He would be the bait. The student leader found it strange when that guy volunteered to be his living bait. The young man said he was calm. If it wasn't him, who else would do it? Unless the student leader wanted to become minced meat himself. It was noticeable that even in such an extreme situation, the protagonist maintained a completely calm expression. The leader could tell that even in those circumstances, the protagonist had found a solution that was best for everyone. He was confident the protagonist was rational, but now he thought the guy was crazy. Jisoo still had her hand over the little redhead's mouth and asked the protagonist what she should do with him. Seeing that his friend wanted a suggestion, he simply waved his hand. It was as if he was saying she could do whatever she wanted. It was as if he wanted the girl to let go so the young man could scream, as if it were part of the plan. Understanding her friend, she released the redhead's mouth, who immediately began screaming. Looking at him as though she wanted to knock his teeth out, she thought he was unbearably annoying. The protagonist acted as if he wanted that young man to suffer as much as possible. After screaming a lot, the redhead, with an evil expression, thought it was unfortunate. Everyone would offer themselves, and he couldn't claim the reward just for himself. While the protagonist picked up a red cloth, the student leader asked if there was nothing else he could do. Even now, he seemed concerned about everyone's lives. He didn't agree with someone sacrificing themselves just so everyone else could gain a few minutes. He seemed extremely upset about leaving everything in the protagonist's hands, who asked everyone to run on his signal. He threw something towards the minotaur and jumped, waving his red cape. He expected a quick and immediate reaction from that giant monster. As soon as he got its attention, he continued waving the red cloth in the same direction. Seeing the minotaur's attention entirely on him, the protagonist shouted for everyone to run. The student leader pointed towards a direction, instructing everyone to run non-stop until reaching the entrance. Everyone ran frantically, as if their lives depended on it. However, the monster continued roaring. They were instructed not to look back to avoid being frightened by the beast. In the midst of all this, the student leader just gained an ability called Command a Shout. Even then, he worried about the protagonist's well-being, who at that moment was dodging some chains launched at him. The Minotaur was aiming directly at him, intending to crush him as it had done to the others. But unfortunately for it, that was no ordinary player, but someone who had already beaten this game once. Heading into the second round, the protagonist was going all out. If it depended on him, he'd beat the game again. He was dodging spectacularly, preventing the Minotaur from even touching him. The student leader stood paralyzed, witnessing the protagonist's skills and how effortlessly he evaded. To him, it didn't make sense. It was as if the Minotaur were someone, and the protagonist was a fly constantly slipping away. His attention snapped back when someone called him, saying there was no time to think. They had to run. Everyone was rushing towards the other side of the entrance. He would think about that later, once everyone was safe. When everyone reached the safe zone, the mission was completed. Completing the mission elevated everyone to the gold ranking. Rewards would soon be distributed. The young student leader felt relieved that he'd managed to survive. After catching his breath, he checked to see if everyone was alright and wanted everyone to confirm the condition of those nearby. They noticed everyone was fine. He thought it was now necessary for someone to help the protagonist. When he turned back, he encountered a blue barrier, which instructed anyone inside to return. From within, he shouted that everyone had reached safety and begged the protagonist to quickly come back. However, the protagonist turned to see what he was talking about and shouted that he'd return soon. While watching what the boy was saying, he got distracted for a brief moment and seemed to be struck by the Minotaur. The student leader's eyes widened, unable to believe what he saw. He thought this was the end of the guide who had saved their lives. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued facing severe difficulties near the sentinel. Someone appeared to have been thrown very high. After tossing the protagonist upward, the monster delivered several more blows. It waited for him to fall near its fist, so it could strike again. Finally, like a fly swatted by a newspaper, the protagonist crashed onto the ground. From afar, they saw the decisive blow being aimed at the protagonist, who was still lying on the ground. Everyone felt deeply sorry, as the one who had saved their lives seemed to be in trouble. Watching from a distance, everyone felt remorse and silently apologized to the one who'd saved them. Jisoo watched in disbelief. She hoped that at any moment her friend would get up and return to her side. She approached the blue barrier quickly. The protagonist was thinking that he hadn't been a sincere person in his previous life, and when the guy had said thank you, he'd felt terrible. Now, with strange eyes, he thought this situation wasn't so bad. However, when the Minotaur struck the ground, dust and debris flew everywhere. But he wasn't like he used to be, just a weakling. There were many players stronger and more talented than him, but his only thought was to survive. That was the choice he'd made. That's why, this time, he wouldn't choose to be a selfish weakling. Winning and ending up alone was meaningless. Now that he'd come back, he knew this. The other ending couldn't be that bad. He looked at the Minotaur and said they'd fight seriously. On the protagonist's system message, his data appeared. His name was Kim Sehan. He held the title of Second Chance Player, was in single-player mode, and his stats were at level F. Even so, he called the Minotaur a cow face and challenged him to fight. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and at the moment of impact with the Minotaur, he swiftly used 94 points to boost his resistance. Since the Minotaur was also an F-rank boss, he thought the Minotaur's skills had stalled at that level. He'd already reached the maximum status for his F rank. This monster was designed so that no ordinary player could defeat it. In the previous round of his life, he'd simply fled. But if there were no other options, he used everything he had. Therefore, he used every trick available, because this time would be different. With this determination, he charged fiercely at the monster. He forced the Sentinel to struggle to match him in combat. Things were going so badly for the Minotaur that he was even grabbing it by the horns, although to do so, the protagonist had to spend 83 points to boost his strength. He'd reached his maximum strength limit. He couldn't spend more points on that attribute. Now looking at the Sentinel, he felt they were evenly matched, and that's why he'd treat it like a plaything. Using the Minotaur and its horns as leverage, his status showed that the Copper Chef belt was still available. Upon activating it, the protagonist himself seemed like a barrier that the Minotaur struggled to overcome. He made it clear to the Minotaur that, no matter what it tried, it was weaker. End of discussion. He proved it when he ripped off one of the Minotaur's horns, making it regret having started that duel. However, the protagonist knew that, in his previous life, this was something he never could have done. Previously, he'd won the game but was a solitary and cruel player who only did what benefited himself. Now he was playing entirely differently, something he never could have imagined doing in the previous round. Yet even though cruel, he was strong and remained an unstoppable player. Now he had decided that he would become a hero. He had completed the main mission. With the mission's completion, he rose to Platinum rank. He would receive his reward soon. However, after all he had done, freeing the team, assisting their escape, serving as bait, and defeating the hidden boss, The reward felt ridiculous. Now it was merely platinum rank. He believed he deserved more. Passing through the blue barrier, he hoped his reward would be something useful for combat, rather than just points or supplements. He noticed that everyone had left, except his friend, who still waited, having faith in him. Gently, he asked why she hadn't followed the others and if she'd been worried about him. Confidently, the girl said she knew he'd be fine. She had realized that after becoming part of his group, she could access others' statuses. She said that after checking his status, she saw he was alright. After he'd been struck by the Minotaur, she assumed he was only pretending. Since he didn't want to draw attention from others, she asked what rank he'd reach after defeating the Minotaur. He replied that he was now platinum. He asked about her status, and she responded that she was gold. The system informed him of what he would receive. The reward was delivered because he had sacrificed himself defeating the boss. He thought the system was crazy since it wasn't really much of a sacrifice, considering he was alive. He received the skill Purpose of Time, which was a growth-type skill. He also acquired healing and an additional 100 points as a reward. After having complained so much, he now considered the reward system rather generous. Though the potential of a growth-type skill was high, he was slightly disappointed with its latter half. Curiously, the girl asked if he'd just seen his rewards. He asked if she'd noticed the second message regarding the mission. After everything, they would have to go to the World Tower of Rome. They would need to enter the tower and defeat the boss there. The mission was C-ranked difficulty and had a duration of 14 days. He noticed it was the same mission from his past life. Everyone else had already headed to the World Tower. The protagonist insisted on asking why the girl hadn't gone with them. If she wanted to wait for him, she could have waited there. She sincerely replied that she didn't like crowded places. Besides, there was that redhead guy whom she found very suspicious. When he asked her why she suspected him, she said he had an evil aura. The protagonist was impressed to see that the girl's skills were rapidly increasing and that she had already analyzed that guy. She remained curious and asked if they were going straight to the tower in Rome. He said no, they'd take their time. They had 2 weeks available. Besides, she possessed an ability that suddenly drew attention. He noticed there weren't any observers around. He began to find it strange. He asked if she had accepted becoming an avatar for any of them. The girl replied that she hadn't. Then he said that if any of the gods had chosen her as their avatar, they should have explained the advantages. Once again, the girl surprised him, saying she didn't want to be controlled by someone she didn't even know. And it got worse when they used the word avatar. It made her feel like disposable trash. Even so, he found it suspicious because she had a different personality. He believed she still hadn't been affected by the madness that her skill brought. It was so strong that even experienced players couldn't handle it. She firmly said she just considered it useless for now. Eyes wide and looking surprised, he asked how many requests she'd received. Calmly, she said 12. He found that impressive. That was what it meant to be adored. He wasn't surprised, as she was talented enough to be observed, even though she was a member of his team. But since they'd come this far, he'd help her grow strong enough to handle being a god's avatar. For this reason, they would train some skills, and the thirst for revenge specialized in by magicians who had that ability. It was a celestial berserker technique, and she'd learn and master it as quickly as possible. That technique was a skill the protagonist had never mastered in his previous life, as he didn't possess the ideal physique. Even so, he managed to gain deep knowledge of martial arts after fighting using demonic tricks. With all this, he knew it was a difficult art to master, since it was a growth-type skill. He hadn't preferred this path in his past life, but even though he'd helped her a little, this was too much. He watched the young woman seated in cultivation, noticing her evolution, which was insane. And a few hours earlier, some had been wandering around the area looking for more people to toy with. They enjoyed frightening people for their own amusement, but the protagonist had been using his skill. All his movements became faster for a short period. It lasted up to 5 seconds, with a maximum cooldown of 1 hour. Oh yes, he also managed to have some fun with those little green monsters. It was a kind of training. He wanted to see if his skill could increase his stats. However, he was warned that one of those little devils was coming up behind him with a stake. When he turned and grabbed the pointed object, the protagonist decided he would also have some fun with the little green man. To them both, it was just a game, as the protagonist pretended to punch the goblin in the face. Caught up in the excitement of their play, the goblin ended up flying several meters away. Thus, the protagonist concluded that the healing ability was passive, unlike the Purpose of Time. He wanted to see what would happen if the celestial physical recovery and the VIP brooch combined with this new ability. Since it was for healing, its status was F rank. It provided 50% faster recovery from all injuries. He got so excited about combining these 3 fantastic skills that he shouted, startling his companion. But when the girl saw that it involved the brooch, she also admitted she gained a lot from it. Looking around, he saw it was very quiet. He wanted to take advantage of this moment to share the skills with her. Since everything really was quiet, they went to a cafe. He wanted them both to open their status windows. As soon as they opened them, they began the process of skill sharing. The first skill to share was healing. Next would be the celestial physical recovery skill. He thought purpose of time was an excellent skill. However, for the girl, it was better to maximize healing effect. The status window showed that the power of shared skills would start at 30% due to their superficial bond as group members. It could reach a maximum of 80%, and the system requested confirmation to deepen their bond. He became intrigued about what the system meant by bound by ties. Now annoyed, he opened his status window again. He had 3 great skills, but could only use 30% of each. He felt betrayed. They should have told him earlier. Jisoo thought it was good they gained such abilities right away. However, she was worried about not having any offensive skills. He believed that having a high survival rate was essentially the same thing, as was having incredible recovery. One wouldn't even need to do anything else. This would save the time and energy someone would otherwise spend dodging, which could instead be used for an attack. In other words, healing didn't just restore injuries, it also affected physical endurance. That meant the person couldn't be easily defeated. No wonder people called it a high-level skill. The girl seemed surprised to hear all that information. Moreover, as soon as their level increased, so would their skills. Feeling tired, he told her that since they had plenty of time before the mission, they should sleep a little. They needed rest to master another skill before heading to the arena. When she asked if he wasn't already strong, he said it wasn't exactly that. Nothing was ever enough when fighting against gods. The girl found this odd as he never used to care about anyone, and now he was overwhelming her with information and concern. After hearing her, he felt a bit awkward. He said the skill was perfect for her, and its name suited her as well. It was the celestial technique, and at that moment, she was cultivating to boost gains from that skill. The protagonist planned to use that time while Jisoo was focused to do something else. Connect to the community. Once inside, he saw several communication windows. He noticed the community had grown since the last time he entered, so he would start absorbing information. He entered the chat room. He was Anonymous 48. He saw that, as usual, the gods were having fun. Just by seeing the name he wanted to choose, he already knew which god was being referred to. It was the same one who had chosen the little redhead park as their avatar. Seeing what that irritated god was saying, the protagonist realized the redhead hadn't gained much after all. With that, he started interacting, asking questions and receiving answers from one of the gods. He then received an invitation from Jester to become his observer, allowing him to see everything Jester saw. Now that information was being shared with him, he wondered if such a thing had existed before. The message indicated that his anonymous appearance had been set to private. He saw that the goddess had invited him to her personal observer channel. Looking in his direction, she greeted him upon seeing he was already online. As soon as he accepted, a hologram of him appeared beside her. She pointed her finger, showing who her avatar was. Now Anonymous 48 saw what she was seeing, revealing to him the damage that had occurred. There was a girl who seemed to be hiding, trembling in fear as someone approached her. Shaking and expecting her end, she covered her mouth to keep from making any noise, but the man warned that he'd heard her crying. It was the man in uniform. Crouching down, he asked the young woman if she was alright. With a calm gaze, he told her it was dangerous to stay in a place like that, but she was too frightened and continued screaming, while he just stared at her silently. The protagonist, still hiding his face, thought he had found him. He figured he had to be somewhere around, the person who would defeat the monster in the Tower of Rome, the key card. After interacting in that chat for a while, the moment his friend spent meditating had also passed. Now they were heading toward the small station they'd visited. That place had something special to complete the second phase. He glanced up at the sky and noticed it was too clear there wasn't a single observer in sight. This meant there probably weren't many survivors nearby. Looking ahead, the girl saw the road was a disaster. The girl wanted to know if the monsters had caused all that devastation. The boy answered that, in part, yes. To him, dealing with human monstrosity had become normal. She understood, as without police or the army, people were lawless. He told her it felt like all civilization had disappeared. They also noticed there was a live broadcast. It was visible on a large screen they passed. Of course, the gods wouldn't leave high-status humans alone. She was distracted when she was warned that a little green monster behind her wanted to have some fun. But that girl wasn't in the mood to play with it at that moment. Therefore, it was simply a quick strike. However, during the play, something splattered near her. Still, she was annoyed because her blade was now dirty and dull. The protagonist knew that he himself dealt around 30% damage, while she inflicted 100% additional damage. Walking through buildings, he told her they would search for weapons later. Looking up, The girl wanted to know why they were standing in front of a bank. Both knew money no longer held value at that point. However, he explained there was an essential person there for the second stage. Even amid the chaos, some guards still wanted to help people and fulfill their duties. The guard was trying to save as many people as possible. The protagonist and his friend were observing him. Though he was just a guard, he was unusual. He was far too quick. The robbers thought no one should have been there. However, that man wanted to fulfill his duty until his last breath and was well trained in martial arts. Besides powerful kicks and blows, the robbers weren't appreciating such resistance from a random guard. However, the young guard was strong and skilled. Seeing an opening, he quickly struck the man below the stomach. Frustrated, the robber said he couldn't do that, as he was also a player. With a serious tone, the guard warned him that he had nothing else to do there, so he should leave. Turning his back, the key guard thought it was all over. They were just some weak punks. But from a distance, the protagonist was still watching his moves, and the girl found it all incredible. Accustomed to doubting everyone, the protagonist thought the guard had a hidden reason for acting that way. Just by his look, he knew he was an avatar of one of the gods. However, when they met face to face, the guard asked if they had business at the bank, since that area was extremely dangerous. Showing a friendly expression, he asked the two of them to leave and head somewhere safe. Demonstrating he wasn't a rookie, the protagonist said there was no way a bank could be operational now. Being direct, he asked if the guard knew someone named Lee Mina. When the guard heard that name, he reacted strangely. Then he tried to disguise it. Smiling, he said it was the first time he'd heard that name. He then decided to introduce himself and stated his own name. Jisoo became curious about something regarding the guards group, mentioning they seemed agitated. She wanted to know why he was so restless, noticing how his pulse had quickened. She thought he must have been quite surprised by what her friend had said. The girl asked her friend if he'd already known all of this would happen. The young people were becoming annoyed with the two and asked them to identify themselves. The protagonist wanted to know if there was anyone who knew his true identity and noticed that the guard's attitude had changed. There was an observer directly above him. He pulled his cap down, trying to hide his face. This made the protagonist realize the guard wasn't yet skilled at acting. He also noticed that the observer belonged to the jester. He always appeared that way during a special edition or something similar. He decided to teach a lesson that would entertain her greatly. First, the guard removed the girl's hand from gripping his wrist, wanting to know how she knew anything. The young man said he wouldn't tell anything even if he knew. Therefore, the protagonist made it clear there was no use hiding it anymore. He demanded that the guard immediately reveal his ability. The guy lowered his head, adjusting his cap. He wanted to know where that man had come from. He had even pretended to be weak to throw them off. All this was done just to take the real guard's uniform while leaving him barely alive. Now equipped with the guard's clothing and belongings, he believed he could fool someone. Suddenly, the girl revealed herself. She abandoned the disguise of the friendly guard. She wanted him to answer why he was following her. She wished to know why he wanted to find her. With angry eyes full of madness, she said she was busy. After hearing that, the protagonist asked why she was trying to take all the money from the bank. As for his friend, she wasn't sure what he was talking about regarding the girl with the transformation ability. He explained that the girl could transform herself into another person or even an object. After saying this, he deeply hoped she wouldn't ask how he knew about it. Jisoo wanted to know why the girl was busy robbing a bank. It seemed as if she had been helping those people. The girl confirmed it, saying that she was indeed helping those weak people. She needed to gain their trust, because posing as a guard rather than a high school student would earn her more recognition. However, the protagonist proved wise and knew she had brought the robbers there herself in the first place. He stated that she wouldn't get anything because there were people wanting to hide. When confronted directly about her actions, she tried to deny it, claiming she had even fought the robbers. But it was clear, she had orchestrated everything to betray the robbers and take all the money for herself. The people understood that the place was dangerous and wouldn't attempt to hide there. Looking directly at her, he asked if he was wrong. The protagonist knew the little redhead and this sneaky girl were the best at deceiving people. With his current experience, there was no way he wouldn't know that, as he'd witnessed it multiple times in his past life. The girl wanted to know if he'd hand her over to the police or something like that. He said no, as it wouldn't do any good. Instead, he occasionally offered her an invitation to join them temporarily. The girl wanted to know how long temporarily would be. The protagonist replied that it would only be until they finished the second mission. She assumed he was weak since she was already on her third mission. Suddenly, she asked what stage he was at and how many monsters he had eliminated. Of course, he wouldn't tell her. He simply said she didn't need to know. The girl became annoyed. Seeing her pouting, he said he would give her some points since they'd be part of the same team. It was astonishing how quickly her manner of speaking changed, as she'd previously been quite rude. Feeling the need to assert hierarchy, he gently flicked the girl's forehead, but she felt as if she'd been repeatedly struck. She was shocked that someone managed to land a hit there. After flicking her, he said everyone should be respectful to each other. The girl reacted strangely. She demanded to know what made him think he could hit her, and she'd stay quiet. She prepared a punch to hit him, but was stopped by Jisoo, who had no trouble restraining her. While being held, the girl couldn't believe this young woman was so strong. With her eyes fixed on the short-haired girl, she believed she could break free whenever she wanted. However, showing no concern for the girl's threats, the long-haired girl continued firmly gripping her arm. The girl then began asking to be released, fearing her frail arm might get hurt. The girl noticed that the young girl couldn't transform when she felt pain as she lost focus. Perhaps her weakness had been revealed. The girl wasn't pleased at all. However, the young girl said she wanted to be respected. As her friend had said, they were humans, not animals. Seeing that Jisoo was tough, the short-haired girl agreed and insisted that she let go of her arm. As the protagonist watched the two of them, he asked the young girl what decision she had made. Meanwhile, the three were being spied on by the observer. The young girl seemed to be aware that the other two were also avatars. The protagonist said no and told her she didn't need to speak so strangely. The girl asked why they were so strong. He replied that being an avatar wasn't the only way to become strong. There were also players who had their own potential. He explained that what mattered were equipment and good strategies, showing this by displaying a brooch. However, his friend's concern was whether they'd manage to find good and suitable equipment since everything was in chaos. Opening a status window, he confidently said they'd surely find something. He connected himself to the safe zone. Soon, questions began to emerge. They wanted to know how the protagonist knew it was the right place. That was when he said it was easy to tell, based on the shop's condition alone. Jisoo observed that it was true. There were traces of theft, yet no signs of monsters having passed through there. Nina thought the observations made sense and wanted to know what kind of equipment could be found. With some maneuvering, the protagonist managed to open the purchasing point. The young girl could hardly believe it. Even though she was an avatar of one of the gods, she didn't know about that place. Slightly embarrassed, she admitted she couldn't ask anyone about it, as she wasn't even sure of their existence. Looking strangely at that girl, the protagonist thought it was the god's duty to inform her of everything. But he also knew the jester was known for having a sadistic personality. To ease things, he told her he had discovered all that by chance, assuring her that they were still in the early stages. He warned the two that, later, they wouldn't be able to buy equipment before the second stage was completed. Nina was irritated, but she knew he was right, so she just stayed quiet while he ordered them to pick items that would be useful. And she wasn't sure if she should try certain benefits at that moment. Apparently, she'd take the risk. Looking upward at the items, she realized the charm was in their effects. There were also no healing potions, because soon, players capable of crafting their own items would appear. But for now, that was the only way to get equipment. He should be grateful for weapons like these at this stage. He should also choose something sufficient for the current situation. He called his friend Han Jisoo, saying there was a defensive item used to protect the heart. Handing it over, he told her it would be difficult to use points on equipment, considering she was already spending them on stats. Then he asked if she wanted a sword. She became excited and asked if there was a sword, spear, heavy weapons, and bow and arrows. In that case, she'd want a heavy weapon. He picked a mace for her. With that, she took hold of the heavy weapon, as he thought it was easier for her to swing something heavy rather than poke someone. The little one also wanted to receive something. Then the protagonist, looking at Nina, told her he had no intention of giving her anything at all. After all, she'd rejected it before when he'd offered it to her. That was when he told her each item cost at least 200 points. She should have saved up instead of trying to rob a bank. Then she did the math. It amounted to 2,200 points. She wanted to know where he'd gotten so many. After that moment, already nighttime, with monsters not stopping their attacks in any situation, the three continued fighting for survival. The weapon the protagonist was using pierced not only the goblin but also the wall. He thought this was far too easy. He was planning to test another impact weapon he'd receive as a reward. Upon taking out the origami, he intended to test weapons he hadn't tried yet, and upon reading its description, it seemed like something in both solid and liquid states and could also be retrieved after use. Therefore, thinking it could be effective, he decided to take it out and test it. The origami's coating was completed, turning it into a short sword. He had heard it was the strongest metal in the world, and it certainly seemed true. While thinking about that, they quickly arrived. It was the Tower of Rome. The protagonist enjoyed teasing Nina. He told her she should have already gotten used to all the changes the world had undergone. Otherwise, her chances of surviving without adapting would be very small. The young woman debated, finding it funny that only she was asking, but wondered what their second mission was. It was then that the protagonist told her that they should capture the boss. She didn't even know there was a mission like that. She explained that their mission was simply to survive. When he heard this, he looked at the girl and realized why, in the other life, she hadn't lasted long. It was a mission where they had to choose whether they would eliminate targets or just keep capturing them. Comparing the two missions, he thought that theirs was much inferior to the one she had received. After thinking about these things, he announced to the girls that someone was hiding, watching them from behind the wall. He could see there were two guys. He just didn't know what they were doing. They might have been standing guard, since they were raising a barrier. Hearing this, Jisoo said she couldn't see the monster and wanted to know if it was really there. That was when her friend replied that they were being cautious about foreign humans like them. Then he looked at Nina and said that when he mentioned them, he meant only himself and his friend. He asked if she knew what he meant. She understood what he wanted, for her to go and ask about the situation. He looked at her with a satisfied expression. He said that was the quickest way. Afterward, he asked her if she didn't want to, making a wicked face. She said she would go, feeling pressured. While they were still hidden, she separated from them to get closer to the guards. She noticed that the guys who were supposed to be guarding were just sneaking around. With that, she tried to keep calm. Looking at them, she thought she just needed to wait for the moment they looked away, then strike them, catching everyone by surprise. And as she put her plan into action, the two watched from afar, noting how sinister and quick she was. Despite being small, she wasn't playing around. She made the entire movement without the other guard noticing her presence. After she hid the person she had copied, she thought he was very heady. She released a bit of energy to face the other, because when he noticed his partner was gone, he started looking around. The guy thought his friend was just hanging around somewhere resting. That was when the friend returned. Of course, it wasn't him. It was Nina in disguise, telling him she had just had some matters to take care of. Approaching strangely, she asked the other guard why he would report to the higher-ups or something like that. The other guard replied that it wasn't the first or second time he disappeared. If it kept happening, he would have to report to the supervisors. With that, Nina, disguised as a man, relaxed, thinking she had been caught immediately. However, Jisoo thought the girl was acting very poorly and could get caught. Meanwhile, the girl followed the man to learn more about him while pretending to be the other guard. With difficulty, some people climbed the Tower of Rome until reaching the last floor. They were waiting for only those who could easily defeat the boss and move on. However, when they stood before the boss, they noticed it was bigger and stronger than expected. With wide eyes, they couldn't believe a beast of that magnitude could be the boss of the second stage. Although their group consisted of several people, the animal in front of them was something bestial. With just one glance, it could intimidate and clearly show who was strongest. Some went into shock, thinking it was insane and unsure how they could defeat something like that. One of them had the idea to retreat, asking everyone to leave, but the animal had no intention of letting its prey escape. To it, despite its large size, those numerous people were just ants. It would hunt them one by one until none were left. With fast and precise attacks, those humans stood no chance. Thus continued the capture by the boss, second stage, against those insignificant humans. Some had a bit more endurance and could run, dodging an attack or two. However, they all knew their fate was to be captured by that boss. One of them reached near the door. He thought that if he managed to get out, he would join one of the gods. However, they quickly noticed something strange. It seemed they were being manipulated. Something was blocking them. Their exit would now be marked with consequences. Of course, most were already going crazy. After all, the end was obvious when one of the men was captured by that beast. The others saw it rain from above as the beast chewed on what it managed to catch. Now for everyone, that small group of 10 to 15 people had reached their end. As soon as they faced the monster, they quickly begged to be saved. The screams lasted for some time. It was known that the top of the building hid the boss of that stage. Although he was extremely strong, the bigger issue was the mission's requirements. The entrance to the boss's hall is where the problem began. A person could only enter with those who had cleared the first stage. As a result, only one team could complete the mission. It was basically Team A versus Team B. Nina observed everything and knew no team could give up, and besides, there was a penalty for anyone who failed. After observing and collecting a lot of information, she passed it on to the protagonist, who analyzed it carefully. Based on her information, he understood that the team arriving last would handle the basement. However, when he got there, he encountered that arrogant young man again. The young man believed the guy wouldn't be among them anymore, but the protagonist had thought the same about him. Besides being alive, the protagonist noticed that the young man's XP remained as it was before. The guy commented that he was very lucky. The protagonist's friend found it strange to see that young man being so respectful. He asked that guy to let him see the council president. The young man was considering whether or not to let the protagonist talk to the student council president. Meanwhile, he was watching a little guard who was suffering. When he turned his head and asked the protagonist to follow him, the young man nearly had a heart attack. The fright he had attracted the protagonist's attention, who was observing everything around him. Telling everyone to follow him, he showed his base to everyone. People soon realized that the young man was the same person who had stayed behind when fighting the Minotaur. He was upset because there were many observers, as he also had a large number of people. Something around seemed to bother Nina, who asked if everyone there was in the same stage as them. She also wanted to know how his stage went, because everyone kept staring at the protagonist. He said he had just gotten rid of the monster while the others ran away. However, that story wasn't convincing at all to Nina, who wanted to know exactly which monster he defeated. He told her it was the Minotaur as Sentinel. Things got even worse. Nina made a funny face and asked if such a thing even existed. The girl poked him a few times to stop joking around, though he insisted he was serious. When she realized he was telling the truth, she couldn't believe it and demanded to know how he managed it. She wanted him to quickly explain how he did it because she didn't believe him. While she was arguing with him, someone from afar heard them and called out to him. It was the student leader. He could hardly believe that the guy was alive and was relieved to see the protagonist. He soon gave him a strong, long hug, the kind you could even hear ribs cracking. Seeing that, Nina asked Jisoo what was wrong with that guy. Hyun had been taking shelter in that place since they arrived later. Listening to what the young man said, the protagonist thought it matched exactly what Nina had reported. The idea was to eliminate the boss before the guys above could do it. The student leader said they couldn't simply face the others directly. However, the protagonist said they only needed to take down those bastards who arrived first and wanted to manipulate everyone. In doing so, he recalled his past memories from when he had cleared the game alone. Now there were bosses inside the tower, and one of the two teams was targeting it. They needed to act quickly, because whoever failed to eliminate the boss would suffer the penalty, and of course, the penalty for failing the second mission. It would be something so unpleasant that none of them would even want to consider it. The protagonist wanted to make sure everyone knew about the boss. The plan was to surrender and tell the others to go first. The student leader could hardly believe what he was hearing, thinking it must be some kind of joke, especially since the protagonist doubted whether the one at the top was really the true boss. The leader said that if he'd seen the video, he would think the same way. It was a monster that could never be considered weak. That's why he confirmed it through the video the other team recorded when they met them, and also from the message he received when they reached the tower, which confirmed the boss was indeed in the Tower of Rome after inspecting all the other floors. When the protagonist heard this, he wanted to know if that was how he had arrived at the basement. He answered that it was. The protagonist explained to them there was a huge difference between a boss and a common monster. Bosses created their own armies and positioned them nearby. Elsewhere, a young man arrived exhausted, wanting his hang to see something, and he needed to be quick. He was talking to a tall young man with black hair that was long, almost reaching his shoulders. The guy had a subtle look in his eyes. He asked what it was about this time, wondering if it was those bastards again. The messenger replied that indeed it was those guys again, but this time it was different. There were some new people with them, and that's why they seemed to be acting differently as well. Elsewhere, the protagonist, already gathered with other people, asked the red-haired guy if he was coming with them. With that, for a moment, the two looked at each other, each secretly thinking badly of the other in their own way. Meanwhile, the student leader announced that he was already going with them, as they had reached a consensus. When the girls, Nina and Jisoo, heard the student leader say that most of the members of the other team were criminals, they were shocked. Those guys had been in guilds in Korea since the first stage, but besides them, there was a guild that had drawn a lot of attention due to their abilities, because it was formed by criminals who escaped from prison as soon as the world changed, the worst guild of all. It was a guild that discarded other people like insects for their own benefit, willing to do anything to advance. The person who created that guild was called the Sin. His name was Kim Jun-won, who at that moment was leading his small army, observing the new arrivals. The student leader stepped forward to speak to the Sin, who expected him to be there to fight for territory. But it was different. He explained that they had come today to share what they'd been thinking about. The man, belittling the young man, made it clear they had already refused an alliance. However, the student leader now wanted to explain that they could move forward toward the boss on the last floor, and they were there to give space to the Sin's group. That lunatic man suddenly made an even stranger expression, unable to believe that an insect was trying to yield something to them. Despite the insults, the student leader continued, saying that since they had no chance of winning against them, their team would find another solution. He said that he believed as soon as they eliminated the boss, another might appear. That was what they chose to believe. The protagonist observed the student leader, who was lying calmly and easily. Curious, Kim came down from where he was standing to hear the man's proposal more clearly, asking if he was serious. He warned that if they were plotting something else, they would all be eliminated. He now displayed an entirely hostile aura, carrying a kind of weapon in his hand, in addition to chains wrapped around his body. This was too much, even for his own subordinates. Hyun, shielding his eyes from the dust, told the mysterious man that he was being serious. As he gave his promise, the protagonist watched from afar, thinking that no matter how many times he experienced this feeling, it was still strange. The protagonist knew that guy was an avatar of one of the higher gods, known as Haze. After hearing that nonsense, Kim asked the rest of his team what they thought about all that. One of the guys said it didn't really matter. If the others hadn't given in, they'd take it anyway. Another said they could simply eliminate him if he was plotting anything, and their leader agreed, saying it was good that he knew they wouldn't blindly trust them. Lowering his head, the student leader said he would stay there while they dealt with the boss. It was a kind of guarantee. At that moment, the red-haired guy, looking like a traitor, told the student leader that he was the commander. He couldn't just abandon his position. Because of that, he offered himself to stay behind as the guarantee instead. In his place, the leader accepted and said that if he changed his mind at any moment, he just needed to let him know. However, Kim, the leader of the other team, didn't like the suggestion of leaving just one person. It wasn't fun. He wanted everyone who was with him to stay, got it? Opening his eyes in a strange manner, he said he especially wanted the young girl with long black hair. He was referring to the protagonist's friend, who immediately stepped between them. Having drawn attention, the Sin's leader wanted to know who the bastard daring to oppose him was. The protagonist thought that guy was suspicious of the girl. Since he didn't know about the celestial physique, he must have felt something else. The student leader found it strange and asked why he was suddenly doing that. But that ex-convict simply walked past the student leader, targeting the protagonist. Once face to face, that man thought his rival might be quite skilled. When others from the same team noticed someone was trying to match him evenly, they tried to come down but were reprimanded. The young man with the huge scar on his face wanted to observe the guy more closely, as he suspected he wasn't someone normal. While being watched himself, he warned his opponent that if he stepped out of line, he would cause trouble for them. The Master of Sins never thought he would hear something like that, especially since he was feared by everyone there. He wondered if what he was seeing could be an illusion. Suddenly, something appeared in front of him. It looked like a carnivorous plant coming from that girl. The girl in question was Jisoo, who had heavenly physique and whose intent to kill was extremely strong. His companions told that leader that these people didn't know their place and should be reminded of it. However, the guy seemed not to be listening anymore. His vein bulged out, and his heart was beating very fast. This happened just by looking at that girl. Placing his hand on his friend's shoulder, the protagonist asked her to calm down. The girl, returning to her gentle self and dispelling the illusion the guy had seen, told the protagonist that, for a moment, she felt some kind of rage. After observing his rival's reaction, the protagonist concluded that what he saw must have been something powerful. Even though the guy was a cruel lunatic, he felt fear. Sweating but now with a calmer expression, he no longer displayed that arrogant air of superiority. He said he would accept the initial proposal. He agreed that only the red-haired boy could stay. The others should leave. The student leader, the young man, asked if they were leaving, and deep down, it was clear he needed support to remain standing. Meanwhile, Kim, supported by another person to stand up, thought he wouldn't let any of them get out unharmed. He wanted to ensure he completed the mission and made all of them perish from the punishment they'd receive. Already returning to their place, the student leader felt relieved, as he had feared something terrible might happen. Even though the protagonist assured him that he didn't need to worry about that guy, especially because they needed to prepare. Some people began seeing notifications that they had entered the safe zone. There, people could buy their own desired items. The leader hadn't even imagined something like that existed, and when all those people were introduced to such wonders, they were able to purchase equipment to strengthen and protect themselves. Now they felt more confident. He approached the protagonist, who asked him what he thought of all that. Now everyone was shopping and acquiring items. The student leader asked the protagonist if the other guys would just deal with the monster and stick around afterward. That was exactly what Sehan thought would happen, since he knew that, for them, nothing existed after defeating the boss. While he explained these things to the student leader, the other leader, the one representing Sin, was watching his subordinates handle things. Returning to the protagonist, who was talking on his cell phone, he told someone to remain on the other side. Then he was caught off guard by his friend, who wanted to know who he was talking to. Despite the surprise, he said he needed to talk to someone. To change the subject, he showed her the equipment they would be using. There were rings, stones, and a spear. The young woman recognized the spear. She wanted to know what the other things were for. The protagonist replied that what she called rings were actually training bracelets. They could be adjusted according to weight, ranging from red to purple. She asked if he would train with them. He said no, mentioning there was someone else who would really need them. Then he asked if she was ready. She only needed standard defensive equipment and her iron mace. Seeing him with that large spear, she asked if he knew how to use it. When hearing the question, he couldn't tell her that he'd learned it in his past life, and remembering this, he wondered how his instructor was doing. Now her interest had shifted to the weapons he had. Another star? He told her none of them were, as none were particularly special to him. After all, he couldn't say that they were all at the same level. He'd mastered each one of them. There was something only he knew, the difference between winning and surviving. Talent wasn't necessary, at least not for him. The one who overcame the strongest and the best, the one who survived alone until the very end. That someone was Sayonappa, the protagonist who had beaten the game and held everything in his hands. He thought maybe this time he might receive the title of strongest. While thinking, he saw the student leader approaching him, complimenting the spear he was holding. However, he noticed that the student leader had become an avatar. He hoped it wasn't one of the evil gods, and when asked if he was ready, the student leader replied that he was there to ask for a moment. The protagonist said that he and his friend would do something else. Meanwhile, the young man wanted to know what it was about. However, his question was somewhat ignored. Seeing that the young man's curiosity persisted, he showed him the spear, and the young man saw that it was glowing. It was supposed to be placed in the middle of the room. After finding the boss, he was warned that if the spear was visible, it wouldn't be enough to handle the boss. The protagonist would send him a signal by phone to lure the boss towards the spear. A message was sent. It had begun. It was the student president, informing them that they were ready and heading to the basement. The red-haired guy didn't understand what kind of preparation could have taken so many days. It was enough time to eliminate the boss 3 times. He thought it must have something to do with the protagonist. He felt that guy was plotting something. One of the gods whose avatar the red-haired guy was told him that the protagonist was tricky and that he should be careful. Because of that, he would take the necessary precautions. He called the guard standing outside the cell, saying he wanted to discuss something. Thus, he requested to speak with the leader, as it was something serious and couldn't be said to them. The red-haired guy tried convincing the guard by saying it was something that would improve the mission's efficiency. He knew the protagonist was quite skilled, but he found Kim's abilities more realistic. If he had to choose a side, he would definitely choose the side of that tall, mean-looking guy. With his smooth talk, he managed to handle the situation and convince the guard to take him to their leader. On the way, he was amusingly told that if he tried anything suspicious, he would be severely punished. In what seemed like a sewer filled with rats, the student leader was there, along with others, eliminating those rodents. He thought it was a great idea for everyone to go together, just as the protagonist suggested. Something was happening because the monsters emerging from the darkness were weak against the light. While discussing this with the student leader, several other monsters tried attacking the group. All of them were swiftly eliminated by those who were moving ahead and trying to clear the path. Young thought their numbers were increasing for no apparent reason. He also noticed most of them had already been dealt with. Sehan told the students that those insects were merely too clever, though that wasn't what he really thought. They had walked a long distance, about halfway already. They were at least on the 3rd basement floor with a total of 6 floors. But this wasn't news to the protagonist, who seemed very familiar with various places. Nina's message, informing that she was heading down, caused the protagonist to give a slight smile. A massive explosion was unleashed through a fierce attack by the other team, led by Kim. As he delivered that strike, he thought this wasn't something a human could handle. He recalled the video he had watched. It was a basilisk with a malignant gaze capable of petrification. He thought that, even though it was just a snake, he should be cautious. At that moment, someone called out to him. It was the guard bringing along the red-haired guy, saying that this young man had something to say. The deceitful young man approached respectfully and politely the leader, explaining that the others thought the real us was down in the basement. Hearing this, Kim's comrades thought that was the reason why the others had easily given up the boss on the upper floor. They realized the others wanted them to get into trouble. It was just a trap using human psychology. Their leader couldn't believe those brats had tried to trick him. He wouldn't leave them alone now. The red-haired guy thought they could fight all they wanted. He would simply side with whoever won. It was just a matter of nullifying the punishment with the skill he had received from the manipulator. The guard, looking at the boy, said everything had been resolved thanks to him. The treacherous red-haired youth humbly said it was nothing. The red-haired traitor was leading them to where he thought his companions would be. But upon arriving, he noticed that no one was there, and now he would appear as a liar. Frustrated, their leader ordered them to search everywhere. There was no way that place could be so empty. The guard who was watching the red-haired guy told their leader he thought the others had already gone downstairs to quickly complete the stage. Everyone else, holding something in their hands, agreed that they had to find something and would give them the proper punishment. The leader thought there was a chance that was exactly what had happened, so he decided they would all go down. All of them were eager to find the other team and deal with them in a casual and brutal way. Meanwhile, they thought it was too dark. As they descended, they had to be sure of where they were stepping, as they hadn't brought torches. They spotted 2 people from afar and called their leader, saying they were those bastards. As soon as Kim laid eyes on the pair, he noticed it was indeed them. The protagonist, showing his sarcasm and cynicism, said he felt bad, but the lower floors were currently off limits. After hearing all that nonsense, the guys accompanying the leader thought those 2 should receive punishment immediately. However, the protagonist thanked the red-haired traitor, as he'd already known he would betray them and side with the enemy. The redhead got angry for even interacting with him, saying they thought too highly of themselves, but this was the end of the line for everyone. Then he looked to the side, at the gentle guard who had fallen for his tricks, and asked if he also thought the same. However, as soon as he asked, The man vanished into a golden mist, revealing Nina's identity. She was furious with the protagonist because he made her work non-stop, and he didn't even know how much trouble she'd gone through. The redhead could only think that it had been far too easy to gain that guard's trust, when it was actually just that brat. The protagonist continued saying he had devised a plan to get rid of them all at once. Addressing Kim and also mentioning the manipulator, he said he'd destroy him along with all the others. Nina wanted to know what they should do. The protagonist warned that in this situation, a fight would be unavoidable. The girl refused to fight. She said she'd leave if things went wrong. The guy told her she could do whatever she wanted. He was preoccupied with his thoughts, aware that time was running out though. Jisoo told the protagonist that he could go, she just needed to hold these guys back for a while. He knew it wasn't necessary for everyone to stay. He knew she'd be fine. He told her that, in that case, he'd head upstairs. That's when he picked up little Nina, holding her in his arms. As for the pill, he shouted at the young girl not to eliminate anyone, just to restrain them. Jisoo thought it was a shame, as she really wanted to take care of that cowardly bastard. She agreed, what a pity, but she tried not to beat him up too badly. Of course, they were referring to the sneaky redhead. As the protagonist was leaving, Kim's weapon chains reached out towards him, but he was already aware he'd be attacked. The chain-wielding guy got upset, realizing he couldn't properly track his rival's movements. As expected of a protagonist, he was very agile and skillful, even carrying the girl in his arms. She was already feeling dizzy from so many rapid and abrupt movements. On the other side, the guys were falling one by one, struck by the girl with the iron mace. Her orders were clear. If things became too dangerous, she should simply abandon the place. Things looked uncertain, but the young man trusted her with that responsibility. Every passing second, the young girl overflowed with energy from her heavenly ability. Just as he was saying he'd lead this to her, he could sense the chains approaching again. However, they weren't fast enough to touch him, and Kim realized he couldn't keep up with his opponent's movements. Instead, he ended up receiving a powerful punch, strong enough to break bones. Kim now considered the possibility that his rival was an avatar since he was incredibly strong as well. The punch he threw sent Kim flying a great distance, landing on top of his subordinates. His gang members couldn't make sense of what had happened. It wasn't just the low-level ones, even their leader was in trouble. The redhead and another asked the leader if he was okay. The man was furious and demanded they capture the protagonist. He believed if they could just bring the protagonist to him, he'd handle the rest, even though he was visibly suffering pain in his injured arm. When they looked ahead and felt the monstrous presence of the approaching girl, they couldn't even stand on their feet, dropping to their knees in front of her as she declared that absolutely no one would leave that place. She swung her iron mace, denying anyone the chance to get past her. Kim felt devastated every time he looked into those eyes. They seemed disgusted, as if she were looking at mere insects. He felt humiliated and had a strong desire to eliminate her if he could. With a scream filled with fear and rage, he ordered them to eliminate that girl immediately. Gathering their courage, some of them moved towards her. All she told them was to try to keep things very clean. She hated when a move went wrong and something splattered onto her. Therefore, she aimed for swift and clean strikes. Many didn't even realize what had hit them. Though angry, she was extremely fast. Using that speed, she was taking down one after another, always searching for the next target. Even if they tried to evade her blows, they wouldn't succeed. Most of the time, they didn't even notice when she approached. Each time the young woman was struck by the opponent's bodies, something within her intensified. Even if 2 or 3 armed men grouped together, they still weren't enough to handle her. With just a single strike, she reaped all 3 at once. Even heavily armed or filled with hatred, they weren't sufficient. Standing apart, merely watching everything unfold, the leader remained in that sewer water, witnessing his vassals being crushed. Before his eyes, that woman was treating his subordinates like mere insects, disturbing her. Even though there were more than 30 of them and that girl was alone, she still crushed them without growing tired. Adjusting the chains in his hand, he thought that girl was definitely not normal. Now he relied on his own speed to match hers. Physical strength and speed should mean everything. The young leader believed he was at the peak in these areas. However, the moment she threw her iron mace at him, he grabbed someone beside him as a shield to avoid getting hit. He couldn't believe it. As the avatar of Hades, he should be stronger than that girl. He would use the manipulator's sentence, delivering a death sentence to her. If this skill struck its target, they would have less than a minute left. But of course, it didn't apply to higher level targets, and he judged himself to be at a higher level than that girl. This would end that insolent brat. It would be the end for someone who thought she knew more than he did, and didn't respect her proper place. He believed that the avatar body given to him by the manipulator was the highest level, especially since it belonged to Hades. He observed the girl as a reaper of death would, yet when he went to attack her, he felt a profound fear. The girl simply turned to whip him and then immediately turned her back again, not even wanting to look at him. The man, realizing he'd been struck and his head had been severed, felt discouraged, believing he was important to Hades. Nina, running after the protagonist, asked him if it was okay to leave Jisoo alone with those criminals. The protagonist replied that the girl probably wasn't enjoying herself. Nina wanted a clearer answer than that. Nana commented that it wasn't as if the opponents were that strong. When she had infiltrated them earlier, she noticed their leader was basically a fossil. It also hadn't been long since that guy had become an avatar. Given the amount of time evaluated, his only skill should be the death sentence. Nana knew that if he clashed directly with Jisoo, his head would roll. Regarding her pursuit of the protagonist toward the rooftop, she wondered what he was thinking. He simply said it was exactly what she was thinking. They were heading to the rooftop. It didn't seem the girl wanted more detailed information. She knew he was strong, but this felt excessive. Therefore, he said he was taking her with him. Startled, the girl asked what kind of help he expected her to provide. She thought it might be something like information, but the protagonist said that wouldn't be enough. When they arrived, they found themselves facing a very large gate, and he called the girl to follow him forward. While standing at the door, he asked the girl if she'd done what he'd requested. She said she had, but it was extremely uncomfortable. Therefore, she hoped to receive an appropriate reward for her effort. He told her not to worry. He would buy her an item worth 2,000 points as a bonus, depending on the mission's reward. She asked if he wasn't lying since she thought 2,000 points were a pretty big deal. However, she would have to transform into what he'd requested earlier. She would need to turn into a weasel. She made it clear that she'd only do it because he was asking, though she wasn't sure if it would work. She could transform into a weasel and wrap herself around his neck. He asked if she was ready. He said they would enter now and give it their all. Arriving at the location, he thought everything was a total mess. People who had entered previously were still petrified. All of them had suffered from looking at the basilisk. Now he asked the weasel, who was actually Nina, to find out where the basilisk was. Calmly, she said she'd be fine. She just had to move quickly and carefully. He said that if her tiny legs couldn't handle it, he could throw her if she got too scared. To prevent him from doing that, she ran forward while he watched from the doorway. He noticed that she had found it. Since it was very large, he thought she didn't have much trouble finding something of that size. He figured it was the sentinel of that stage. The basilisk thought another fool had arrived. He wasn't even polite when introducing himself, simply stating that his name was Orga. He told the protagonist he wouldn't take his life if he surrendered at that moment, but was rebuked with the protagonist stating that he wouldn't give up. He had a purpose for coming there, and he would fulfill it. Unlike the Minotaur from the first mission, he knew this bastard even had a name. He thought that a named creature wasn't something that could be easily defeated. This was the true sentinel, and the most annoying part was its skill, the evil eye of petrification. He figured that when the basilisk opened its eyes, the evil eye of petrification would activate. Any living thing that made contact would be petrified. However, he spoke to his weasel, reminding her of what he had said earlier, that it was time. Nina, in her fluffy, white weasel form, glanced from side to side, but the protagonist said she didn't have to do that. He asked if he really needed to throw her as she waved her little paw. Pretending to be kind, he said that if she couldn't do it herself, he would generously toss her. That's when she willingly jumped. With her little eyes shut, she struck the basilisk's eye. At that moment, the protagonist knew it was the perfect time to face it. Since the evil eye of petrification was a skill with a cooldown, he had to target its eyes while it couldn't use them. Seeing it had been hit, the creature backed away. The basilisk, annoyed, knew he had purposely aimed for its eye. The protagonist thought the basilisk was essentially declaring that mere cutting weapons wouldn't work against it. Having reached this crucial moment, the protagonist knew everything now depended on the weasel. That's when he noticed something moving towards him. He was sure he'd been directly hit by the skill earlier. He realized that creature was a weasel, and according to folklore, one of the basilisk's two natural enemies was the weasel. That was the champion's weakness. The basilisk was certain the protagonist had figured this out and had found its weakness, but it was merely a small creature. Because she was so small, she couldn't possibly face it. Yet he saw she moved incredibly fast. She even jumped up and held tightly onto its scales with her sharp claws, enraging the basilisk. That's when it activated its evil eye of petrification, staring directly at the weasel. It asked if she was just a careless little weasel. Meanwhile, the protagonist thought the girl would probably get depressed. The basilisk told the protagonist that he had thought things through, though it didn't know exactly what his plan was. But he should realize nothing would work. That's when it launched its evil gaze toward the protagonist as well. However, before the eye could work, the weasel charged forward, attempting to pierce the eye with her tiny claws. Before starting to fall, the weasel succeeded in scratching the basilisk's eye. To ensure the girl, still in her weasel form, didn't get hurt, The hero jumped forward and caught her in his arms. He told the girl she'd done very well. Now everyone was free from those petrifying eyes. He heard someone mention that this weasel wasn't just an animal. The protagonist replied that this was obvious. He couldn't just grab any random weasel off the street and start taming it. The two had to be careful because the basilisk was coming toward them. However, the protagonist jumped away with considerable agility. He figured that, since the basilisk was huge, its movements and attacks were easy to dodge. Yet even he might not survive a direct hit from the basilisk, even a mild one. The basilisk declared that it wouldn't let either of them leave. That's when the protagonist noticed it was coming back. He glanced at a notification on his phone and realized it was time. He said something to his weasel, reminding her about the signal he mentioned earlier. Each went in a different direction. They split up, the hero to one side, the little weasel to the other. The idea was to confuse the basilisk for now. However, the huge snake noticed they were up to another trick. That's when the protagonist said he couldn't defeat it without resorting to at least one trick. All this seemed very amusing to that enormous beast, who thought it could defeat him no matter how many tricks he played. Even if he could block the skill, that wouldn't lessen the challenge of fighting it. Therefore, when he stopped, the basilisk lunged forward with full force. Now the protagonist no longer knew if he could dodge it or not. The basilisk declared this was something humans referred to. The protagonist, noticing the difference in skills, nevertheless looked toward the basilisk without feeling any fear. Although he thought he should act before it was too late, he couldn't react quickly enough. But according to the basilisk, he talked too much. Planting his arms firmly, he snapped his fingers. The basilisk wondered what he was doing. That was when a rooster appeared. Yes, it was white, just like the weasel, and just the presence of the rooster intimidated the basilisk. Seeing the basilisk becoming agitated, he realized that this was the perfect moment to act. Holding his sharp weapon, he believed this was the skill gap he had mentioned earlier. Hearing these words, the basilisk didn't find it amusing. It decided to attack him as well. Although the protagonist's agility was superior, the giant beast wondered how long he could keep resisting. The sentinel continued talking, saying that the protagonist might discover his weaknesses, but it still wouldn't be enough to defeat him. He knew his scales were difficult to pierce. The protagonist could try, but he'd only exhaust himself. He could keep running around like that. However, even though the sentinel said this, he was deeply bothered by this insect. He kept running from one side to another as if he had nothing better to do. However, the protagonist noticed that the beast's movements had become slower than before, and he knew they had to finish this quickly. The sentinel observed that he was putting considerable effort into preparation, but the gap in their status was overwhelming. When that enormous creature rushed toward him, already exhausted, the sentinel knew what the protagonist would do. However, the protagonist refused. Running away was exactly what the sentinel had suggested earlier. He certainly couldn't defeat him like that. The monster felt satisfied that the human finally understood, but it was already too late. However, the protagonist said he already knew that, and had thought of several ways to defeat him, since he was quite accustomed to facing enemies he could never overcome. This opponent surpassed him in every way required to win. The methods included using a manipulator who gave an overpowered statue a useless skill. He could also win using a unique trait. Of course, all these were important, though he had none of them in the first round. The last one left was a stronger man, but the one praised as the smartest was himself. Because he had experience and patience, everything was possible with these two things. Deep down, the sentinel thought it was nonsense and that this would certainly be another human's end. However, repeatedly, the protagonist began landing successful strikes, twisting something correctly without knowing exactly what it was. Even the great foundations of Rome's walls began to crumble. Annoyed, the sentinel asked what that bastard had done. Smiling, he replied it was just a bomb, something someone had planted in recent weeks, and it was the little weasel. Men had placed adhesive bombs that could be remotely activated, having no effect on monsters or players. Even so, the sentinel thought the protagonist was naive since he couldn't defeat him with just a few small bombs. The protagonist said he already knew that. He couldn't eliminate the monster using only his surroundings, but that wasn't what he was doing. Showing his wrist, he explained he wasn't running around for no reason, although it seemed his tiny brain hadn't noticed. The sentinel was amused at being insulted by a mere human who closely resembled an insect. He took a few seconds to realize there was a strange circle around his wrists, showing the sentinel something in his hands. The protagonist said this was characteristic of the basilisk species. It could only see straight ahead. Running nervously, he explained it was a training bracelet that could increase its weight by 10 tons. He told the sentinel that if he didn't believe him, he could test his own weight and feel the difference. When the sentinel tried to change his steps, he noticed his legs were heavy. For a mere human, he considered himself too much. Placing his foot on the sentinel's head, the protagonist decided to mock him a little, talking about their difference in skill. Jumping away from the sentinel, he simply told him to go in peace. His weight would increase enough to make him fall from the top to the bottom floor in a rough descent. The sentinel thought that even if he fell all the way to the ground, he wouldn't perish, and the bracelets would eventually break. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he'd finish off that human. However, something caught his attention. It looked like a golden spear. He didn't understand why it was there in that specific place. That was the second main mission. There wasn't supposed to be any weapon capable of piercing his scales. Since there was no chance of dying, he moved toward that spear. However, he was startled when the spear pierced his scales. He found it hard to believe. While the issue with the sentinel was resolved, the student leader's team was struggling. They were under attack. They knew they simply couldn't land a finishing blow. The leader thought this meant they weren't strong enough, and that made him uncomfortable. The monster in front of him had huge eyes in several of them. It was called a spectator. Seeing the golden spear at the center, and with someone else asking the leader what they'd do if the fight dragged on, he stood still, noticing the structure was collapsing. Looking up, they saw the giant monster falling towards them. Large things were falling from above. They were terrified and didn't know what to do. The object that fell made a massive hole. One monster seemed to have fallen onto another, with the first crushing the second. Since the student leader's team was now free from fighting, they should look for the others. They enjoyed the situation. However, they received a message that they had completed the main level 2 mission. That mission was silver ranked, and their reward would soon be delivered. Now covered in sweat, the young leader realized that based on the descriptions, the spectator must have been the final boss. Seeing the message arriving for him, he couldn't believe his ranking was silver. He hadn't done anything to deserve it. He was also seeing the third mission, whose stages would activate automatically after a certain time. That meant none of them would know exactly when the third mission would start or what it entailed. Returning, the protagonist asked if everyone was safe, satisfied he'd dropped the basilisk in the right place. Everyone stared at him, unable to believe he'd intentionally brought that thing down without getting hurt. The student leader was pleased since everything had been thanks to the protagonist. He thought they never would have defeated those monsters without him. On the other hand, it would have been different if it had been those crazy guys who were skilled enough to easily defeat the spectator. They noticed that both the group of criminals and the protagonist were at similar levels, very different from their own. Seeing their disappointment, the protagonist said that everything had worked out thanks to the leader. He had listened and done everything as instructed from above. The student leader asked what the protagonist had been doing down there. He replied that since they said there was some time before the third mission, he was going to take a look around some places. When he returned from below with his spear in hand, the man wanted to ask him where he was going. He answered he was going wherever his feet took him. The cell phone device stated that if something happened, they shouldn't avoid it and should immediately call for help. He realized they'd be splitting up, but still offered assistance in case they could be useful in some way. Even the little weasel waved goodbye. The protagonist thought everyone had realized how incapable they were after the second mission. However, now he'd part ways with them and hoped he'd be able to reach the 7th mission alone. Although he hadn't asked who his handler was, he'd leave the question for when they met again. Now he was leaving with the 2 girls. Upon seeing Jisoo, she complained that he took too long and wanted to know how things went. Seeing her weapon had changed, he asked if she had switched it after its durability ran out. He wanted to know what she'd done with the guy. She explained she had locked him up and pointed to a place. Reaching him, the protagonist asked how the little red-haired traitor was doing. Furious, the traitor wanted to get out, even more so when he noticed something was on his neck. He demanded they remove it immediately. The terrorist explained it was just an interesting bracelet, or perhaps a fun choker for him. As he already knew, the bracelet was very heavy and immediately knocked the young man to the ground, causing slight bleeding from his nose. Being sarcastic, he asked the player if he could comfortably handle 200 kilograms. The red-haired guy cursed from the ground. He thought it was too much. When he tried to remove it with his hands, the protagonist told him he'd never put on something so easy to remove. After betraying them several times, the red-haired guy wanted to know what he'd done to the protagonist to be treated that way. Therefore, he had to be reminded that during the first mission, he planned to eliminate everyone and gather in the auditorium. Furthermore, he betrayed them again that other time. He was so naive he didn't realize Nina was watching everything. Despite having failed, the protagonist thought he was useful. Without him, they wouldn't have succeeded. Then he reminded the traitor about karma, explained the object around his neck wasn't just a physical restraint, but a mental one as well. He showed the young man something called an absolute contract, explaining to him that once signed, he would never again be able to violate its terms. The contract would make him a generous, trustworthy, and hardworking person from that moment onward, and if it were violated, the collar around his neck would tighten and his head wouldn't withstand it. To some extent, they could be a bit more tolerant, but not with contract violations. The little redhead said he wasn't foolish and wouldn't do that. However, upon seeing the young woman Jisoo's aura, he seemed to reconsider. He would stay. He would just need the pen. He couldn't sign it, he'd simply throw the paper in his face. Also, before leaving, he recognized him, who, through that document, knew exactly where he was and asked him to live peacefully. Looking at him, The protagonist thought he was nothing but a damned rude brat with a pitiful expression. Leaving there, they thought they needed to get moving. The young woman was already thinking about the gold rank. The protagonist knew her points had accumulated a bit due to the party's behavior. Seeing that he was going somewhere, the young woman became interested and wanted to know where he would go. She also had a place she wanted to visit. The two would split up but would always stay in touch through their group tab. Calling Nina, he said he would give her the rewards he promised. The girl became very happy about it. She asked if he knew what would happen if it was really good. To her, a ring called the Ring of Secrecy could completely conceal the wearer for up to an hour. This ring could be used twice a day. The girl was very satisfied, especially since it was a rank B item. However, the young woman Jisoo was looking at Nina strangely. It was so odd that the protagonist asked her what she was staring at. He noticed she was angry. He said he'd give her something as soon as he found something good. Then the three continued while Jisoo asked where the protagonist needed to go. Of course, they were still being watched. Laughing shamelessly, he said he was going to farm a bit, even though he knew he was being closely observed. Those observers were everywhere. He noticed there were many of them, and they seemed to be increasing. Noticing Nina was still following him, he asked why she was doing so. The girl became sad and asked if she couldn't. He said that wasn't it. He thought her observers were the irritating ones. He tried to ignore it since nothing interesting happened when they joined others anyway, but he wanted to know why she was following him. Smiling, the girl said it was because of the time they'd spent together. She noticed he was skilled, so why not stay as companions? She tried to persuade him, saying she wouldn't just follow him. She'd help with anything he needed. He could count on her. Meanwhile, someone asked them to stop. They were attacking that dungeon at that moment. Nana stood in front of him, asking if they wouldn't farm. He asked what she was getting at. Smiling, the guy said it seemed obvious. They would enter since they'd found the place. The girl asked how he planned to deal with them. Smiling, he said he'd just enter. While the two men watched, the young man said they wouldn't just stand by watching. The protagonist said that if there wasn't a path, it was simple. He'd just make one. Meanwhile, one of the manipulators, who called himself an honest person, thought everything was terrible. He was bored. He wanted to know who was messing with his avatar. The manipulator known as the court jester. He wondered if Honest Ear knew who that person was. That manipulator, seeing he was being made a fool of, became upset. The manipulator of the traitorous little redhead was becoming upset, maybe because the young man wasn't doing anything interesting. Someone asked them to stop fighting, as there was a very interesting dungeon. They would accept the first 3 people. It was located an hour from the Tower of Rome. The protagonist knew that was the dungeon the guys had talked about earlier. The stopping point was a place that had nothing. He told Nina it was there. She wanted to know what it was since she hadn't seen anything. He should explain better. He said he was wondering if the dungeon was around there or if he'd have to explain every detail every single time. The girl was annoyed because she knew the entrance was somewhere else. However, placing his hand on the ground, the protagonist said he could make one. He used his skill Explore, and lightning came out of his hand. That skill covered an area within a radius of 50 meters from where his hand was placed. The protagonist knew that was the reward he gained after defeating the basilisk. And, as expected, it was a platinum-ranked reward, so he was going to use it. She was already getting annoyed, urging him to place his hand on the ground. He seemed to be searching for something, but didn't tell her anything until it looked like he had finally found the right spot. When the girl was already exhausted from repeatedly asking what he was doing, he unexpectedly answered that this was the boss room. She asked how they would get there if it was 20 meters underground. Was he planning to dig through the floor or build something like the Tower of Rome? Those were a lot of questions for a small girl. She said they couldn't just enter there by brute force. When he asked if it was the handler controlling her who had said that, she confirmed it. But he also surprised her when he showed her a dungeon drilling drill. It was a digging drill capable of even altering the terrain inside a dungeon. However, he wouldn't use it like that. He would code it. He asked the girl to watch closely, as they were going straight to the boss room. The girl's expression was priceless. Her eyes widened, and her mouth hung slightly open. When he started drilling, the girl sat beside him and asked if it would take long. He replied that it would take roughly 2 hours. Everything was so slow that the young girl questioned if the drill really worked that way. That's when he asked if she wasn't aware of the game's permissions. 5 hours went by. Now the girl seemed to notice something cracking. Quickly, they both reached the end of the hole. The young man landed on his feet, while she collapsed to the ground in relief. A message appeared stating they had reached the deepest part of the dungeon. That place was packed. There was a large praying mantis and several smaller ones of the same species, but different colors. It appeared that the 2 of them had caught the creature's attention. The girl approached, wondering if that was the boss. The young man replied that it probably was, as the smaller mantises seemed like its minions. They already ran to corner the 2 of them. The protagonist asked Nana if she was okay handling the smaller mantises. Satisfied, the girl said it was nothing. The protagonist mentioned he would fight the boss and asked her to watch his back. Saying this, he shot forward, In his hands, he held the steel spear coated with the fragment he'd earned earlier. Meanwhile, the smaller mantises kept trying to strike him as he passed by them, and even so, he used them for support. The protagonist proved faster than the others. That wasn't a big deal. He only had to be cautious about their blades. It was also sufficient to focus on the weak points of insect-type monsters, and he quickly managed to clear the path. The young girl was astonished at how quickly he cleared the path, even when fighting ranked monsters. He continued like that until he reached the boss of that stage. Looking at that creature, he thought this was what diving headfirst meant. Mantises were easier the bigger they got. Their movements would be slower. They would also become more arrogant, to the point of not knowing what hit them. The mantis was struck, and the protagonist simply watched as its head was severed. And just as the protagonist expected, it collapsed to the ground. Now, a message appeared stating he had cleared the dungeon. He had been the first of all players to clear a dungeon. He received an additional 1,000 points as a reward. He also earned a title. I don't want it if it isn't first. The protagonist thought that title sounded extremely weird. He liked that the rewards would increase as he gained titles, but that name had to be some kind of joke. However, he didn't dwell on it too much. He wanted to see what the boss had dropped. He noticed it was an F-ranked magic stone and an E-ranked skill called Fatal Sting. The girl asked if that was all. He said no, those were only the boss's drops. The other rewards went into the loot piles, located on the other side. She was pleased to see they had gotten quite a bit. He told her she could take everything. 4 days later, several people were gathered at the dungeon's entrance. They thought they would be the first to raid that location. Weapons in hand, they raised them and shouted joyfully, claiming they would be the first to attack. Finally, they had arrived, after overcoming all sorts of problems. Since he was an avatar, his handler had said he would receive great rewards if he cleared the dungeon. He could obtain some nice items. Those who went in first shouted back that they hadn't found the boss, but there was a huge hole in the ceiling. The dungeon was completely empty. He could hardly believe it since his handler had said he would get plenty of things. Without wasting time, the protagonist left a note written on the wall saying the next person to arrive had already lost. When the protagonist was back in the chat, he still used the nickname Anonymous48. Upon entering, he noticed his handler was furious because his avatar had intended to clear the dungeon. The more upset he got, the more amused the manipulator became because he found the situation funny. Angry, he asked that woman, the court jester, if she had done something. She could barely hold herself from laughing. He wanted to know immediately, as he was already getting furious. That's when Anonymous48 said he had a good dungeon for him. However, he warned him that he should know what would happen if he was lying. The protagonist, under the codename Anonymous48, said the dungeon was near Joda Station. He said he had checked before and that it had items of at least rank C. The young jester talked with Anonymous48, trying to verify him for the third time, so it seemed legitimate. She wanted to know how he found out. Smiling, he replied that he had his own methods. The honest life manipulator wanted to know where this guy had come from. He didn't look anything like the god of prophecy. Anonymous66 warned that asking about origins was against the rules. Honest Ear mentioned that the guy had practically revealed it when he demonstrated his clairvoyance. Not many gods possessed that. Thus, he wanted to know where he came from, if he was from Greece. However, the other manipulators kept insisting it was against the rules. Honest Life was upset because he was being mistreated and nothing was working out for him. Already tired of waiting, they decided they would attack that dungeon the guy was talking about or anything else they stumbled upon. Now the protagonist was satisfied because all the avatars in the area would head there. Meanwhile, Nina asked him which dungeon they would pick. Her manipulator was telling her to head towards the station area. The protagonist said he wouldn't go there. She got upset as she wanted to go. It would be quick. He remembered that from the third mission onward, the stages would activate automatically. Without a preview, he thought that if things continued, the fourth mission could start, which would be troublesome. The girl asked if that was why they would go straight to this place. The young man said no, they first needed to acquire a skill. Nina knew he wouldn't tell her even if she asked. However, the young man asked her to look at the stars. She looked up just to see if there was something interesting. However, both noticed the sky was beautiful, even though the world was ending. He thought they'd need a sign from the stars. The girl became irritated, as he always started sentences without finishing them. Upon reaching the chosen spot, he told her they would dig. This time he knew where to go, and they'd head straight to the boss room. He had managed to find it earlier because it was deeper than he'd thought. It was annoying as there was no other path. The girl, looking at an item in her hand, thought it was really ugly. She didn't know if it could really protect her from arrows or anything else. It just looked like a rag. She asked if she could put it on only when the monster arrived. The protagonist asked her to stay quiet. Continuing to speak, the girl thought the place was too quiet and wasn't sure if it was really a trap. She thought he should have at least brought a torch since it was a bit dark. He explained to her that he had a good reason for not bringing a torch, and so the two continued entering that place. She noticed they were walking in circles. He realized she was quick at noticing the path they were taking. He placed his hand on her face, covering it with the rag-like cloak, while she was still talking. His objective was for her to stay quiet because they were heading toward them. There were several birds resembling bats. The girl didn't even know what was happening. That thing was heading toward her, and it seemed like they wanted to catch her. She could barely believe that the rag had actually blocked an arrow. What she was wearing was a protection cloth of D level. It would block 5 ranged attacks and would be destroyed after 5 uses. He told her to be careful. She had only 4 uses left before it became useless. It was extremely dark, and there were still arrows flying around. The manipulator's chat was buzzing. Avatars, they were being caught off guard in a dungeon that seemed to have no monsters at all. The protagonist knew that indicated they were in the right place. Meanwhile, Nina wanted to know if, by transforming into something small, she wouldn't be attacked. He told her to look for an opening while being careful with the arrows, and when he gave the signal, she would know. While talking to her, her cloth protected her from another arrow. But it was fine, it still had a few uses left. He wanted to see the face of whoever was shooting those arrows. He used a level D tracker. This could stretch toward the owner of the object to which the thread was connected and had a single use. He was able to place that onto the arrow and released it, which should go directly to the owner whom the protagonist would follow. Every arrow went toward a specific location. He saw where the person was and ran to catch him, but couldn't see his face. He was known as an executor of moonless nights, a monster that moved quickly through unlit areas. His magical fate saved him again, and now there were only 3 uses left. He saw that the monster quickly escaped. He couldn't allow it to simply escape, but the monster attacked with 2 arrows in a single shot. That left him with only 1 protection remaining, and the guy was aiming in his direction once again. Even so, the protective fabric he wore was torn into pieces, showing that the enemy managed to gain some advantage in the escape. However, the protagonist Sargasso continued pursuing him, even as he kept getting hit by those arrows. The protagonist noticed that while chasing that creature, it was smiling, and he wondered why. He knew this was quite common in games, that brownish creature laughing at him. Small animals could be seen flying through the dungeons. They were placed in such a way that neither players nor monsters could interact with them. However, what the monster carried was a light flare. Nina had transformed into a bat and was carrying it. That created a strong light within a radius of 10 meters. If any player or monster stayed inside that area for at least 2 seconds, they would be blinded for 10 seconds. The protagonist was excited. It felt as if it was part of the environment. It was easy to imagine that dungeon being filled with bats. So today was the big show. The easiest way to avoid attacks was to transform into one of them. While piercing through that monster, his cutting object concluded that the enemy hadn't noticed, showing its entire blade right before his eyes. It declared that this was the difference when it came to strategy. After everything was resolved, Nina asked if there weren't secret rooms, like in the praying mantis dungeon. The protagonist thought there might be, but what the monster dropped was everything they'd get in that dungeon. There were no monsters besides the boss in dungeons of that type. He knew that, if separate rewards weren't given, whatever they won, there would certainly be an overpowered skill or reward. They obtained a jacket of darkness, rank C, a pair of gloves of darkness, rank D. It was impossible to ignore the special skills that came with them. Although the items weren't as good as what he was already using, they had Shadow Run, rank B, instantly moving into a shadow within a 10-meter radius, usable 3 times every 5 minutes. He said he would keep those drops. She could choose whatever she wanted from the others, since among them there were also Eagle Eyes, rank B, which allowed precise targeting or throwing at the user's chosen target. The girl said she liked the jacket, but couldn't do anything about it. While the protagonist checked the status window, the girl was still close to that monster. He looked at his status window. He knew he had good attributes and a broken number of skills. Looking at the skills, he was certain that no player was stronger than he was. Still, he knew that wasn't enough to destroy that bastard. He shouldn't have trouble completing the main mission. But what about his own objective? It would always be achieving a perfect clear without relying heavily on luck. He knew he had gotten lucky finding that DLC pack in the first round. The pack would only return after he finished the 3rd mission. The main lesson was still incomplete. He had already used the DLC pack from the first round. Now he had to eliminate that bastard. He knew it was a crow. He had to exterminate it as quickly as possible. They needed to start advancing on the main quest. Meanwhile, the girl, who had her own path, arrived at a place where there should have been people, but there was no one. She was surprised to find no one there. Thus, she thought it best to continue until she found what she was looking for. When she opened the door, she called out for her father and mother. But upon opening it, all she found were several small monsters. They looked like flying balls, and some had horns. She found all that very annoying. However, one creature opened its mouth. It seemed like it wanted to swallow her, making a weird noise. The girl didn't have time for this and decided to retaliate, using brute strength against them. The creatures resembling balls with feathers and wings were in trouble. They didn't have enough physical strength for combat against her. While the girl continued slaughtering them all, one creature got behind her, believing it would catch her off guard. By a stroke of luck, One of them bit her shoulder. The moment she looked and saw the creature biting her, she simply grabbed its head. Placing a bit of strength to free herself, she threw what remained onto the ground. With her regenerative powers, the wound was quickly being neutralized. She thought about what had happened in that place. She found her father lying on the floor. She didn't know how that had happened, how he ended up like that. She knelt beside him and began to cry. She was terribly sad and mourning her loss when the phone rang. At that moment, the person who might be her mother was calling in tears. She answered, asking if it was her mother. The voice on the other side, somewhat eerie, replied that it was indeed her mother speaking on the phone. Elsewhere, far away, Nina and the protagonist were walking when the girl noticed something strange. Something was missing. There was someone standing somewhere. It looked like a receptionist welcoming them to Rome. The girl found it odd for that woman to be welcoming them. She thought that everywhere else had been attacked, except for that park. The young man said it was easy to see just by looking around. The girl wanted to know what had happened because of the strange key. She wondered what hadn't been strange up until that moment. Nina wanted to know why the woman wasn't afraid. That's why she found her very suspicious. The woman said they weren't charging for entry that day. They could end her if they wanted. Nina begged the protagonist not to go inside. She couldn't believe he'd enter such a suspicious place. He told her that there was no way to finish the mission unless they went inside. The woman warned them to pay attention because the entrance and exit were located in different places. That was a neatly arranged place where the people present were neither players nor monsters. They all looked suspicious. It was because of that damned person who controlled the region. The girl became frightened that they were just regular people. However, he explained that everyone was being forced to live a pretend life. Nobody in that place had free will. The girl still thought that was better than if they'd been eliminated. That was what the guy said. The protagonist meant that they were living like that because they couldn't die. He made it clear to her that it wasn't an amusement park just because it had rides and that she should stay alert. He said that finally the quest had begun and something caught his attention. It seemed the same to the girl, who thought it was even easy this time. But despite that, something felt wrong. The girl wanted to know why he was making such a strange face. He told her it was nothing. The quest was a little different from what he'd expected. The girl still didn't understand why he was even sweating. Meanwhile, he found it strange. The quest wasn't like the one he'd done in his past life. He couldn't remember. The quest was rank C. She thought it was very easy. They just had to go on the rides. He noticed that the quest Nina received was the same as the one he'd seen in his past life, where she'd only have to complete 5 combos. The ranking went up, and he received a totally different quest. The only ones who could do something like that were the administrators or the system. He thought that if an administrator had any involvement, they'd have appeared already. Therefore, he suspected it might be the system. It was obvious something like this would happen after eliminating the 2 sentinels. He just didn't expect it to happen so quickly. The girl kept insisting, asking what was wrong with him since he was acting so strange. He just wanted her to be quiet so he could think about what to do. Although the quest had become difficult, other things would be easy. That was proof that the future was gradually changing. The girl wanted to know if the quest was easy or hard. That's when he asked if she ever heard of a game called Roller Coaster Tycoon. He talked about the game in which someone managed an amusement park. He said she could imagine it like a game with an administrator who could do anything he wanted. Many crazy things could happen. Things like tracks ending abruptly mid-air, causing roller coaster cars to plunge directly into the ground, and without any sense of guilt. Those administrators only wanted to see people suffer. The girl was horrified, so much that she covered her mouth with her hand. He explained that the park was managed by an extremely crazy administrator, exactly how he described before. He told her it was all a crow's fault. She wanted to know if that was a sentinel or an administrator, but he didn't have that information. He told her he didn't know everything, nor did he have all the details. He explained there were people who weren't players working there. If the administrator wasn't crazy, who else could be? He wasn't going to tell her about Kara's, precisely to avoid the flood of questions she would ask. There had been many powerful monsters in the world since it changed, and the sentinels stood at the top of the hierarchy. All the stars were on a completely different level, not just in strength, but in their very existence. The one ruling that region was Kara's, the star of the crow. Although he was the weakest of the stars, he was still a divine being. The protagonist thought it would normally be too soon for a star to appear, but this was an exception. A low-ranking star who could freely come and go to Earth, simply to lower his divine status a little. He did this to create the whole scheme currently unfolding in that world. He must have been planning to play around with everyone and then just leave, as no one could even touch him at the moment. Indeed, that was exactly what he had done in the past. Despite being a star with limited divinity, he could inflict as much damage as the strongest acids. The girl said that if it was someone stronger, They just need to be a bit more careful. The protagonist agreed with her. It was best not to be distracted by thoughts like that. She wanted to know if that place looked somewhat different from the park she had known before. One of the people in the park asked the young woman if she'd like to use one of the attractions. He suggested it should be his. With a forced smile and sweating, the man said it would be funny, entertaining, and she could trust him. The protagonist noticed the man's voice was shaky, and besides that, there was something around his neck. The girl also saw it and wanted to know what it was. The young man explained that place was a haunted house. Seeing her fear, the protagonist asked if she didn't like those things. She replied that she was just worried. Suddenly, the necklace started glowing, and the young man appeared desperate, saying he still had a little time left. He was anguished, as if that thing on his neck could explode at any moment, and the light grew intense and red. The girl saw the man exploding right in front of her after that thing around his neck turned a vibrant red color. The protagonist, already expecting something like this, had a grim expression, even biting his lip. He truly felt immense anger toward the administrator. He knew his mission would be extremely difficult since he had to save everyone in the park. There were 138 players and 725 civilians, with a difficulty level of C. After witnessing that man haunted by his own timer running out, and watching him explode right in front of them, with his body ultimately falling to the ground, the girl became desperate. Nana couldn't believe it. She was stunned while the other employees closed their eyes, trying to ignore what they'd seen. From this, the protagonist realized there seemed to be a time limit for the employees as well, just like for the players. Now he knew the quest he received was far worse than he'd thought. The shaken girl trembled and spoke in a voice that barely came out, asking the protagonist what that was. Seeing Nina's desperation, he placed his hand on her shoulder, gave her a gentle pat, and said it wasn't her fault. It was the game's fault for being that way. He knew that in the previous round of his life, most of the people there had obeyed. For anyone who hadn't seen it personally and only heard about it from other players, it was now clear why the place was so calm and empty. He asked one of the employees, "Could you guide us?" wanting to know if they really intended to enter, adding that nothing good awaited them inside. He said that even so, they couldn't abandon the quest, as they'd be penalized if they did. Very sadly, the man replied that even if they didn't abandon it, the outcome would be the same. All the other players who entered that place never returned. But since they wanted it so badly, his job was to present it. That was a haunted house, and the way to win was simple: just reach the end. The protagonist remarked that simplicity was good. It was as sinister as it was simple. They could handle it. They just have to be careful. He handed over a boo, saying he sincerely hoped they'd enjoy the attraction in a good way. As soon as they set foot inside the haunted mansion, the girl was already completely terrified. Even though he told her they were still at the entrance, she insisted on holding onto his arm because it was dark. She also didn't want them to get separated. She herself seemed afraid of being alone to face the mansion. Jel, the protagonist, knew there was no choice but to press forward. When he noticed a trap being activated, he pushed Nina's head down. Shouting, he told her to stay low and run. Several other traps began triggering, and the girl was already terrified. Now there were several monsters wanting to devour her. Even though he asked her to remain calm, she insisted she couldn't. Amid the chaos, he grabbed his spear and started dealing with those monsters. Now he understood why the other players hadn't survived. The monster was fast. Seeing Nina on the ground, sad and crying, he asked what she was doing. Feeling extremely sad seeing her like that, he told himself there was no other alternative. He placed her on his back and began carrying her. He continued fighting and dodging several monsters with the girl still on his back. Every monster that appeared was quickly dealt with by him. The monsters appearing in that place seemed endless. As soon as he eliminated one, several others appeared. The girl, crying, told the protagonist that he shouldn't be afraid, that she trusted him, pulling his hair and telling him to be confident. While the protagonist dealt with Nina's tantrums, he carried her on his back and continued handling the monsters. The girl kept crying louder and louder, irritating him. He didn't know what was worse, the monsters or her tears. Driven by sudden anger, he swung his spear, aiming to finish everything quickly. After all, he'd already memorized their attack pattern. It was the same as in other haunted houses. There were monsters, traps appearing constantly, and then more monsters attacking again. However, the only difference was that these ones were genuinely trying to eliminate them. The traps got dangerously close at times. Suddenly, the girl became excited out of nowhere. He asked her what was wrong and if she was losing her mind. He pitied her because if he'd been there in his previous life, he would have been terrified too. Now he realized it took double the effort, fighting while protecting someone. He asked her to hold on tightly as they would keep moving forward. To make things better, he considered it as training, fighting while protecting someone, something he hadn't done in his previous life. He stepped outside along with the girl. The employee waiting there said he was the first person to finish in less than 15 minutes. As for the girl, lying on the ground relieved that it was all over, the guy kept up his pose, saying it had been quite fun. Trying not to show all her fear, the girl agreed, saying it was fun for her too. He couldn't believe her words, staring as if she'd forgotten how much she cried. The man said it was good that everything turned out well, but the protagonist had something to ask. He wanted to know what those things around their necks were and said he wanted to get one, pointing to the necklace around his neck. The guy couldn't understand why a human would want something like that. After talking with the park employee, he acquired a necklace that could either specialize something or simply explode. Seeing the protagonist covering the necklace with something, she asked if doing that would make him stronger. He realized the girl was pretty clever and intended to test if it worked. He threw the necklace far away, waiting to see what would happen. The girl wanted to know what he was doing. The young man said she'd find out in a second or two. On the third second, the necklace floated upward. Certainly, the necklace hadn't exploded, but it wasn't acting normally either. It behaved strangely. So he achieved what he wanted. He coated the necklace with something that could withstand even the explosion. When he looked inside, there were only pieces left. She asked if he intended to help people with that. She thought what he was doing was an act of pure kindness. He thought it was easy to ignore someone if you'd done it before, which is why he wouldn't ignore anyone else. He felt he couldn't be a good person in his past life, even though he was the one who received help from that guy. The girl wanted to go back. Now he said that even if their necklaces were deactivated, it would still be complicated to move around. That point in the game was safer. If they moved according to the system, the girl knew he didn't have time to walk around randomly. He thought he could gather information while collecting stamps. He asked her if she could handle the roller coaster. She said it would be fine. Any scenario was good enough for her. She ran off screaming like a madwoman. She already had 4 stamps in her hand, leaning on something and thinking she'd never want to ride any of those attractions again. That was just as bad as the haunted house. She thought everyone there was insane. The protagonist was sure she'd have died 4 times if not for him, especially since the roller coasters there had no safety measures. There were even flying creatures around, and worse still, at the end of the splash ride, there was a giant monster waiting with its mouth open. And lastly, the tower had no brakes, so it screamed like a maniac, and they tried to smash them into a mast. But they got lucky and fell into a soft bush. That haunted house was nothing compared to all of that. The girl was happy. There was only one left. It would soon be over, and she could leave quickly. The protagonist told her he thought he couldn't go on the last one, since the park had closed and there was music. He thought it might be some kind of night event. The guy said they should hide for now, since he didn't know what was going on. The girl hoped it was a parade, but strange and sinister figures started appearing and all kinds of crazy games began. It was all so disgusting and frightening that the protagonist preferred to cover the girl's face so she wouldn't see. That was the time when the monsters came out and mistreated everyone. The girl shouted that she wanted to see too. The guy whispered to her saying there were some zombies still alive from earlier. She said okay, she would leave. Let's go. The protagonist warned her it was really dangerous. There were zombie players in that parade. That's why he had covered her eyes. She thought it was because maybe there was a naked woman or that he wanted to watch alone. When she was in the hand he raised, she wanted to know where he was going. Since he himself had warned about the danger, he told her he couldn't be caught. If she wanted to follow, she had to stay very quiet. He noticed the monsters were walking around the park and the staff stood in front of buildings and rides, which meant there weren't many places for the players to hide. He was sure that the survivors of that quest, in the previous life, had said there was a big safari there. From what that guide who survived had said, the people there had been all taken from the first mission straight to the third main mission. Even though that was something normally impossible, Astro Crow made it happen. He was definitely impressed with the games the gods were playing, and although the Astros had divinity, no matter how high their stats were, they couldn't play unless they were one of the gods. Who knows, maybe he had made a deal with some ADM or entered through a system flaw. But what needed to be discovered was what he was planning now. Nina noticed there were quite a few people in the place, just like he had said. The girl asked those outside if it was okay not to go in. She showed 4 happy faces, showing that she had been in some games. Seeing that she had 4 stamps, they quickly opened the doors and asked her to come in. The guy introduced himself, having a common name like all the other players, said he was playing there. He started flattering them, saying they were amazing for having 4 stamps. Even their commander only had 3. The girl was touched by the compliment and said they were very good, while the protagonist thought she was being loud. The guy said they should stay there. He would go tell the commander, but they should stay calm. The protagonist was looking around like he was searching for something. He noticed someone near the bonfire. He thought there were about 200 people there, including players and civilians. Although not all, most were there, which meant that person had to be there too. That's when he saw someone he thought he had to be there. When he finally found him, he was someone he really had to befriend. He was the only avatar of one of the 12 high-ranking manipulators, Hephaestus. The young man in question was Song, a young guy with rounded black hair and glasses, with brown eyes. That young man had been one of the most famous players in the past life, where the protagonist had starred. Weapons made by him were sold for absurd amounts, and all top players had at least one of his items. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that many people only survived thanks to that guy, even though everyone perished in the end. But that guy there wasn't the young man he used to be. He was someone who never lost hope. But now he looked different. From afar, it even looked like the young man had given up on everything. Nina thought she could get depressed just by sitting near him. There was a guy sitting next to that genius. The protagonist thought it could be his brother. He'd heard the older brother didn't make it to the final of the third quest. He approached and asked if everything was okay, if he could sit next to them. The young man was startled. He asked where they were from, since it was the first time they had seen them there. The young man said everyone avoided them for some reason. Who said it was good to have someone to talk to. When the next one arrived, he noticed that the guy's brother was blind. The young man started complaining about something. It seemed like he didn't want people sitting near them, or maybe about everything. The protagonist thought it was best to introduce himself, said his name, and that the two of them were brothers. When he said his name, the girl looked at him like it was something strange. That's when he realized she had never called him by name. The guy was pleased and said he would like for all of them to work together on the quest, and the protagonist hoped it would work out. It was in his best interest to get closer to the two of them, but he also felt uneasy. Even though he looked like a normal player on the outside, he had that huge sword with him. He approached the young man and politely asked if that was a Chong sword, and he said yes. He said that although it might not seem like it, he could fight well, though he was using it more like a cane. The brother seemed to get uncomfortable with what the older one said and looked like he remembered things every time the subject came up. He turned his back to them, showing how depressed he was, and said he was going to sleep. The older one apologized for the younger, said the boy had been sensitive those days. The protagonist told them it was normal to keep secrets from strangers, but in that kind of situation, Chang thanked him the best he could, since it hadn't been long since they had escaped from that guy. The protagonist wanted to know if he was talking about that guy. He said yes, it was the sentinel who ruled that place. He was a huge monster called Iron Rule, and that sounded strange to the protagonist. It didn't make sense to have a sentinel in that area. The only sentinel that should have ruled that area was the organ or basilisk he had already taken down. But there was another one there, not far from the Tower of Roma. Maybe he was the reason the quest had changed and the reason Songwoo was like that. He thought maybe the manipulators had started to notice his presence, since that world was just a game managed by an administrator. But that didn't mean the admin was the king of the game. Above the administrators was the law controlling all the games in the universe. It was called the system, and maybe it was the system itself that made things that way, since it's a sentinel and the hidden monster that the system automatically deploys. Lying down looking at the stars, he thought he might get some info the next morning, and also that he needed to be more careful with his actions. Looking at Nina, who was sleeping without a worry, he didn't know if she was carefree or just bold. But then he noticed Chang seemed to be going somewhere. But where could he be headed at that hour? He reached the guys who stood guard at the gate, and said he'd head out after taking care of a few things. They didn't want to let him go because of his eyes. He said he had no one to go with him. Frustrated, the guys said he knew the area well. He could go alone. They didn't need to worry. They opened the gate and told him he could go, but they wouldn't come looking for him if he didn't return. The protagonist noticed that an observer was following him. There was no reason for one to follow him if it was just something simple. So he logged into the community as Anonymous 48 and went to talk to Jester, immediately asking if she was busy. Laughing, she said it looked like he had been more active in the chat those past few days. She said people liked him, especially because he had some really interesting info. Griff, the protagonist, wanted to know if that was the name of the manipulator he had captured in that dungeon. He wanted to look through Jester's observer for a bit. She got annoyed, saying he could use his own observer. He said there was a player he was interested in, but the public observer was garbage at that hour. He said he couldn't get a personal observer until he chose an avatar, that he was on the edge. Since the player he wanted kept rejecting the request, he figured the guy didn't want anyone, since they were rejecting his request. He said it was a player walking around with his avatar. Then he showed someone, but it looked like that guy was rejecting several manipulators, even though many wanted him. He said he had been watching him since he started walking around with her avatar. If it weren't for Nina, he would have already sent a request, and he insisted on using the observer. She said fine, since her avatar was sleeping anyway, but she wanted him to promise, if he saw something good, he had to tell her first. She wanted to know if he was watching the player he was interested in, but he only seemed to be looking at a screen. He said no, it was someone else. Then he got her invite to join in on her observer and saw that the guy had entered the forest. Why was that guy going somewhere with no one around? He noticed it wasn't exactly a main spot just for a bathroom break, so when he saw what the guy was doing, his eyes widened. He was talking to someone. It looked like he was giving information about the 2 new players who had just arrived. He realized that voice was Kara's, who now seemed to be calling himself the Iron Ruler. The figure asked the man to keep watching everything and reporting back to him. After saying that Master Karas wanted more people to join the game, he quickly vanished like a hologram, and the man stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed. When the water-powered engine faded, he stood up, needing only to be guided by instinct or a faint light. After noticing the tree where the bird had landed, he knelt before that blue light. The protagonist had seen countless people pretend to be something they weren't, so he figured, that man was nothing more than an informant, someone meant to report anything suspicious. Just her liked the unexpected twist. She didn't think that guy would be a spy. He told her it was a secret. According to what he had heard from Songwoo in the other life, his brother had been virtuous. He sacrificed himself to save him. Now aware of that intruder, he went around asking questions and gathering information. He talked to a few people and collected what he could. It wasn't easy, but at least he got something. Everything seemed very similar to the past life, except for one thing. That wretched being known as Iron Ruler. A starfish was something quite common, even for monsters. It was a creature with very solid and tough skin, although it was very slow due to a skill that increased its defense and attack stats as it consumed metal. That one was incredibly strong. The protagonist couldn't even damage it with his current skills. And what if, by following Kara's commands, it was only making everything worse? He was thinking out loud when the girl arrived. Nina wanted to know what he was doing. She said she knew what it was, but he wasn't seriously thinking of taking down the Sentinel, was he? She remembered he had gone through a nightmare fighting one, and now he already wanted to try again. He said that this one wasn't too far beyond his limit. She replied that he spoke as if later it would be possible. He agreed that it would, if everything happened according to his plan. Looking at Songwoo, he knew the guy wouldn't be okay, even if they stayed there. Only time could heal that. He told Nina he had something to do. He was going to head out for a bit, meet someone, and also needed a favor from her. He wanted her to keep an eye on those 2. He'd explain why later, but she should stay nearby until he came back. And if anything got weird, she should call him right away. She figured it wouldn't be hard at all, just watching those 2. He put on his coat and headed off to see what Iron Ruler was really capable of. They were in one part of the map, but where he was going was the opposite, a sort of upside-down castle, a refuge for various monsters, something like a haunted house, where fear and agony ruled. But he knew those were the 2 secret ingredients for leveling up. He had only gone there to have fun, and now he thought it had been a great choice. That large, dried-out hand with huge nails was watching Iron Ruler while enjoying the scene in front of them. That grotesque presence, barefoot with massive wings, told the monster before him that he was having a great time. And it was related to the park's attractions. He was no longer the guy who had passed 3 attractions and earned 3 stamps. He thought that when wearing a dress, everyone trembled in fear without even earning 2 stamps. The mammoth with a dried plum face said that was the case until the day before. That caught the master's attention, and he wanted to know what had changed. The guy, a mysterious player, and a girl managed to get 4 stamps. The girl was being helped by manipulators. That was making the grotesque figure queasy as he watched them pass through the roller coaster and even Slash, the tower, and even the haunted house. They must have gone through a lot of trouble, not to mention how hard it already was. But that didn't stop them. They just kept going. And by following him, it was simple. He would get the 5th stamp and complete the mission. Karas knew it would be tricky for him, and Astro, to get directly involved so early. That's why he needed a more convenient way to handle it. He figured that if that guy showed up there, things would get complicated. But he let it happen. It would actually be good if at least 2 players completed the mission. The mammoth found it strange how the number of companies trying to complete the attraction had decreased. The players were trying not to get hurt since the difficulty of all the rides was very high. The number of people entering had been reduced, and that's when Karas explained that if at least 2 managed to complete it and leave the park successfully, the others would be encouraged, and it would be more interesting to watch their defeat. The mammoth thought it was a splendid plan. In that case, he would enjoy himself while there was still time. After saying that, the mammoth excused himself. The other being knew it was time for the mammoth to begin his patrol. Karas thought that creature was very loyal, even though he had assumed he was just a naive fool. However, the conversation didn't involve only Iron Ruler and Karas. There was someone else, a man with black hair and a red stone on his forehead, possibly another manipulator. The mammoth wanted to see several bugs, which is why he was going to patrol diligently. Meanwhile, wandering nearby was the protagonist who believed that this was the route Iron Ruler normally took. However, he was waiting to ambush him during his patrol. As soon as the mammoth arrived, that man was already waiting. Didn't even think twice about eliminating that nutjob. It wasn't even fun. The protagonist knew that was exactly what to expect, coming from someone who followed orders and thought just like Kara's. He only wanted to see the players running, escaping the plans. That mammoth rose high to strike toward the protagonist, who quickly dodged all the obstacles. He held his sword forward, even some stones had been thrown at him, though everything felt very rough. Even though he had lunged at the mammoth and hit him with the coated sword, he saw it didn't cause any damage. He noticed the mammoth ate metal, even while patrolling, and was being cautious. If he weren't cautious, he wouldn't waste time chasing Chang every day. The monster believed that even without unleashing his full power, it was already hard for any regular player to deal with him. The protagonist kept trying. The mammoth wanted him to say something, thinking he was too weakened to speak. The young man landed and spoke, saying all sentinels were chatterboxes. He was there to talk, wanted the mammoth to go down without a word. The sentinel didn't know where that guy had come from, but there wouldn't be a single hair left on his head to tell the story. The protagonist wanted to see how far that mammoth could go. He observed the mammoth's movements, who was planning a strike. He moved immediately, climbed onto the mammoth, and now he would strike back himself. Since the sentinel was so big, he left massive openings. At a certain point, his eyes widened. He had to neutralize the incoming blow. Despite not taking any damage from such an attack, he still had the strength to retaliate. His sword hadn't lost durability either. The creature's body shouldn't be tougher than the coating. He kept attacking to see if he could get any different results, and concluded he lacked strength and energy. Weakened, it was time to receive the counterattack, which came as a slow strike. Due to the mammoth's size, his weaknesses were exposed, quickly spotted by the protagonist. That happened. He didn't even think, just attacked as fast as he could. The big guy seemed to feel the impact and let out a high-pitched sound, causing the protagonist to leap back. Seeing the first attack worked, he got into position for more. But he felt disappointed, as he still wasn't hitting with the necessary force. He thought he could win by being more agile. He had already maxed out all his stats. That was the only reason he could fight that guy. His current attributes were all at the maximum count, and even though he had the highest stats among current players, he still couldn't even scratch that monster's shell. He was tired of dodging and evading, trying to find gaps that didn't really exist. He knew that bastard would eventually leave an opening big enough for him to strike. It wasn't surprising that other players would freeze up just hearing the name of that giant. That was a sentinel, so Kara's stats had to be astronomical. He had planned to catch the raven there, but now he'd think of another way and buy something from the DLC. The mammoth was furious. That guy kept pestering him and fleeing like a mosquito. Then the protagonist replied that he was the one acting like a slug. Those words enraged the sentinel deeply, who swore. He began striking wildly in all directions, since he couldn't see where the intruder was hiding. Since the protagonist had kept track of the time, he knew he couldn't stay there arguing any longer. He knew he couldn't defeat Iron Ruler with his current weapons and strength. He would need a fatal blow if he wanted to finish it. In the end, he realized there was only one way. He needed to get that guy out of his depression and make him craft weapons again. Meanwhile, the young girl was being bombarded with questions from Chang. The girl was annoyed by so many questions. The guy wanted to know if the two were siblings. She replied that if they were, they wouldn't be that close. The girl snapped that the two brothers didn't seem alike at all, as they stayed silent all the time. Chang apologized for asking so much, saying he was just curious. When the guy mentioned the 4 stamps, she also showed hers, saying she wasn't just anyone either. She was bragging about being amazing when the protagonist arrived, giving her quite a scare. He wanted to know why she seemed surprised to see him return. She said it was because he'd appeared out of nowhere, without her even noticing his presence. Chang explained they were just talking about him. He asked what the conversation was about. Nina said the guy wanted to know how they met and if they were siblings. The protagonist bluntly told the truth. He said he'd met her while trying to rob a bank. He was equally straightforward when he said he needed to speak with Chang privately, but this wasn't the right place. He told Chang to follow him. Though Chang asked where they were going, the protagonist simply replied that he'd find out soon enough. After walking a bit, the protagonist stopped. He asked Chang if he was the one reporting everyone to Iron Ruler. As soon as that name was mentioned, Chang immediately drew his sword. He placed it close to the neck of the one who asked too much, demanding how he knew about that. The protagonist calmly said he'd made some moves, and he had questions to ask, but it didn't seem Chang would wait. He placed his hand on his head, appearing very relaxed, while Chang demanded to know what this meant. Facing the enemy, the protagonist said he'd have to fight him at full strength first. Only then would he see what Chang was capable of. Upon hearing those words, the young man with the sword lunged at the protagonist as if his life depended on it. Being smart, the protagonist dodged a few times, evaded, and stepped back. He noticed that Chang wasn't bad at all. Despite lacking sight, he knew exactly where the enemy was. Even though the opponent was visually impaired, he could see with the eyes of his soul. He concluded this just by observing the way the man moved, holding the sword toward the protagonist. The young man said it had all been arrogance, and now he was just dodging. Chang concluded the protagonist wouldn't talk, so he should eliminate him. The protagonist was startled by this attitude, and the swordsman charged at him. He was also surprised by his opponent's sword skills, who was equally shocked when he saw his sword blocked. The protagonist used just 2 fingers to do this. He guessed Chang's agility was around 60 to 70% of his strength, which were very high stats for someone who wasn't an avatar. In short, Chang had invested everything into strength and agility. Nevertheless, the swordsman lunged at him again, changing his stance and jumping into the air. He launched multiple attacks, and the protagonist repeatedly dodged them. Once more, the swordsman assumed a difficult stance, marking what he believed was the end for the opponent in front of him. Yet the protagonist continued dodging. He made so many movements that he even began to sweat. Chang was already exhausted from trying to land a hit, but still hadn't succeeded. The protagonist was wearing gloves, the gloves of darkness with high durability, defense, and resistance to magic. The protagonist admitted he was surprised by his opponent's strength, and Chang responded it was nothing compared to his rival. The protagonist asked why Chang was playing the role of a spy for those monsters if he was so strong. Upon hearing this question, the man said nothing. Seeing there wouldn't be an answer, the protagonist changed his approach. He asked if Chang was doing this because of his brother. He insisted, questioning if Iron Ruler had promised to keep his brother alive if Chang cooperated. The man answered yes. When they'd encountered that guy, Chang had tried to fight him. It couldn't even be called a fight. He was basically a plaything. It was impossible to defeat someone like that monster, and it was there that Chang lost his sight, leaving his brother depressed. He had the choice of accepting the monster he saw that day. It was the devil himself. He would do anything to save his brother, even if it meant going through hell. The protagonist asked how long he'd been an informant. Chan replied he'd been doing it since they arrived at the safari. He provided more details about the player's behavior, and now wanted to know what the protagonist planned to do. He asked if he would tell everyone about it, but the protagonist replied that he had no intention of doing anything at the moment. The protagonist went on, saying it seemed he hadn't harmed anyone yet, and that could provide them with an advantage, since they could discover what that damned creature intended. He asked that guy if he knew anything about the animal's plan. Somewhat fearfully, he revealed that everything would happen within a week, and that was when the man realized this guy was planning to face Iron. Chang said he knew the protagonist was strong, but that mammoth was on a completely different level. He claimed any plan would be useless, but the protagonist told him he already knew that since he'd already encountered him. He explained that the creature's shell was very thick, but it didn't mean they couldn't eliminate him, just not at that moment. Chang wanted him to explain what all of this meant, but the protagonist said things would remain as they were. He would go somewhere, and when he returned, he'd share the plans with Chang and his brother. He asked Chang to tell everything to his brother, as he truly needed to know. When Chang asked why, the protagonist explained that he was the most important person. Only after some time had passed did Chang finally finish telling his brother about everything that had happened. He apologized as he didn't want to cause even more worry, but he had to let him know. The younger brother was very irritated, believing such information shouldn't have been hidden since it affected both of them. The older brother was deeply regretful, and Nina wanted to know if that was why the protagonist had asked her to keep an eye on them. She wanted to know what he planned to do next, and her friend revealed that he intended to destroy the monster Iron Roller. The girl quickly accepted it, thinking there was nothing else to expect from him, and he said they could still complete it. However, they couldn't finish the quest at that moment since the monster was actively searching for him. The girl, tearfully, asked what they would do, while the younger brother wanted confirmation if everything was indeed true. The protagonist approached them and asked if the older brother had informed him about the situation. Now they knew they had at most 1 week, and the protagonist said there was no other choice. Doing it alone was impossible, and that was why he needed help, specifically the younger brother's assistance. The driver revealed he might try making a weapon capable of destroying iron. The young man clenched his fists tightly, determination visible in his eyes, clearly demonstrating how much he wanted to complete the mission. With that, the protagonist took the young man to a place where basic production equipment awaited him. Songwoo was amazed at all those tools and raw materials. Meanwhile, Nina wanted to know where the protagonist had acquired all of that, and he said it came from a quest earlier. Of course, this was a lie. He had purchased everything from the DLC, but he wanted to hear from the boy whether it was sufficient for forging. The young man confirmed it was more than enough and tried forging something, asking him to test it afterward. Approaching the boy, Nina asked if it wasn't strange to do things in that place. The boy believed he was creating something helpful, which motivated him. Without looking at the protagonist, she told him that first it was her, now it was that boy, and that she knew he'd been planning this from the start. When the protagonist heard her calling the boy a child, he revealed the boy was only 3 years younger than she was. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Today she finally realized it, as he told her the boy was in 9th grade. Because he looked so young, she thought he was in 4th or at most 5th grade, but they both decided to let that matter go. The protagonist asked him if he could try making a shield for them, but Nina pretended not to understand, claiming she had no idea what he was talking about. Then she got startled because he knew something about her that she'd never mentioned to him. With that, she ran away quickly. He knew Nina's specialty was distracting people, and since this was already the 3rd quest, she should have gained more abilities. She drew a line on the ground and visualized something, creating a spatial distraction around the young man so no one could see him. She explained that, unless she gave a command, no one would see or even notice his presence. He thought Nina was extremely useful, as she made the entire place seem to disappear. He didn't expect anything less from someone who had a high-level manipulator. That was the reason nobody could find her. She decided to run away, like she had done in the past life. The difference after acquiring a high-level manipulator was enormous. The avatars became visibly stronger. Searching his inventory, the protagonist took out some iron bars and handed them to the young man, saying he could melt them down and make something. The protagonist explained that materials like these could be obtained by clearing dungeons. The young man asked what he was supposed to do with all that. He assumed he was supposed to craft a spear, sword, or some sharp object, but that wasn't the protagonist's plan. He handed him a piece of paper, instructing him to try making that design. Looking at the paper, the young man had many questions, whether the protagonist had created it, and how he'd obtained it. The protagonist merely said it was a weapon capable of defeating Iron Ruler. Meanwhile, the mammoth was wandering around, searching for the insolent man who had dared challenge him. Since the man already had 4 stamps, he assumed he'd look for Pinto as he was very strong. He figured that since he'd received no news from the spy, everything must be peaceful. As soon as he finished that thought, a giant bear came running towards him, shouting. Karis was looking for the mammoth. He became excited, thinking he would finally have some fun after a long time. Satisfied, he headed in that direction. However, the bear warned that the other monsters should also get ready. The mammoth didn't care anymore. He simply wrapped his trunk around the bear's neck. He told him that he alone was more than enough. The girl wanted to know if the monsters were really coming. The young man said he didn't know. He was only there because the protagonist had asked. Meanwhile, people down below shouted that they should hurry and take the escape route. They assumed other monsters might appear separately. Nina knew they'd been ignored when they initially told everyone to prepare, but the mood changed when they saw the stamps. While thinking about this, they heard tremors. She volunteered to check what it was and quickly transformed into a bird. She swiftly reached the sky. Leaving the frightened young man behind, she saw it was the mammoth. It could only be Iron Ruler. Upon seeing the massive monster, she wondered how the protagonist planned to defeat it. Landing again, she reported that the monster was very close. She told the young man to warn everyone else to speed up a bit. Not even she expected the monster to arrive so quickly. This made her consider whether she should flee. However, recalling all the times the protagonist had helped her, she believed they shared a friendship. That feeling was stopping her from simply fighting for her own survival. She wasn't sure she should distract the monster. Arriving from behind, Chang told her not to attract the monster's attention. The girl was startled to see him there. She hadn't imagined he would also try to fight. The man said there was no way he could flee and abandon his honor. He knew he couldn't win, but if he could delay the monster even briefly, it might give everyone else time to escape. With that thought, he rushed toward where the mammoth was. This made things even more difficult for her. She didn't know when the protagonist would return. As those small squares moved onward, she thought everyone should run, evacuating all the civilians first. He ran swiftly, determined to take responsibility for having spied on everyone, serving as Iron Ruler's eyes and ears. He needed to buy time, no matter what happened. When he finally reached a certain spot, he told Iron Ruler he'd been waiting for him. The giant creature thought the man was quite dedicated. He still had those reference cables and suggested they hurry if he wanted to catch the people as they fled. He would even show him a shortcut immediately. However, the mammoth refused. The reason was simple. He wouldn't listen to someone who was clearly trying to buy time. He already knew the man wasn't the type who'd come there just to help him. After saying this, he turned his back on the young man, who couldn't let things end that way. Seeing that the man had taken a stance, the mammoth was surprised. He told the swordsman that it had been quite a while since they'd last fought, hoping he'd improved since then. That swordsman was willing to sacrifice his life if it bought more time for others to escape. Trusting his instincts and sharpened senses, he charged toward the mammoth. His intention was clear: strike down that sentinel. The mammoth asked him what the point was of relying solely on agility. He remarked that Chang needed a better weapon, as his current one couldn't even scratch him at that speed. Esther complimented Chang, saying he'd done well to stay alert until now. Sweating, Chang knew this would be his end. In his mind, he apologized to his brother for failing so miserably. Right afterward, the mammoth slammed into the ground, shattering a large portion of it. Something caught his attention. It seemed his attack had been blocked. The protagonist asked him what the point was of relying solely on strength. He also said he should have eaten metals of higher quality. The sentinel noticed it was the human from before, asking what he had used to break his arm. The protagonist replied that he had returned because he missed him, and this time he brought along a friend. The weapon on the protagonist's arm was called Toneladora, and he intended to use it to destroy that enormous creature. Meanwhile, Nina was floating in the skies with her wings, trying to see what was happening, feeling quite annoyed. He was busy handling that situation, and now she had to babysit Song-woo. She landed and stayed near him. The boy said she should hide with him, as that place was safe. She agreed it was safe, but remained worried because she didn't know how the protagonist would manage to defeat the monster. They both heard noises that made them quite terrified. Meanwhile, the fight continued between the protagonist and that sentinel, as both were large-scale fighters. Battle, work, noisy guide. Mammoth thought the protagonist was a damned filthy bastard and kept striking. He believed that if he could land even one punch, it would be a one-hit kill. However, the protagonist was extremely agile, and Mammoth couldn't even tell how he moved so quickly. Mocking Mammoth, the protagonist asked if he'd gotten slower since their last encounter. This irritated Mammoth immensely, but although the protagonist was deliberately provoking him, he genuinely felt Mammoth had slowed down. He didn't know exactly why, but Mammoth certainly wasn't faster. Perhaps due to his broken arm, he looked completely disoriented. Still, he wanted to finish Mammoth off in a single blow if possible. The sentinel shouted that the protagonist was frightened even after coming all the way just to face him. He was also attempting to destabilize the protagonist mentally, but the protagonist wasn't running away. His weapon simply needed time to recharge, and meanwhile, he had to defend himself however he could. Now less than a minute remained for the recharge, meaning he had very little time left to live. He had to try his best in the short time remaining. He thought it would be impossible to defeat Mammoth, especially since this was only the third quest. He couldn't understand how he was being pushed around by such an arrogant fool. When the weapon finally recharged, the protagonist made his next move clear. Desperately, the sentinel asked him to wait and tried making a deal. He promised not to kill any more humans. However, his proposal was not accepted. Everyone noticed Iron Cullen's presence disappeared, and the protagonist gained the title Sentinel Hunter. Because of that, he would receive rewards corresponding to the title, dealing 30% more damage to sentinels. The protagonist tried to remain calm, but those creatures weren't called sentinels for no reason. He needed to become stronger and faster. Chang asked if the mammoth had really been eliminated. The protagonist confirmed, saying even a starfish wouldn't survive if his strike landed on its head. Chang found it hard to believe that such a huge monster had been defeated, asking how he had managed it. The protagonist couldn't answer, as several observers were present, so he told Chang he'd explain later. He didn't look at the observers, but he knew they were there and felt that it was quite unfair. Those who were trying to escape now knew the sentinel had been defeated, and everyone was free. Chang thanked the protagonist for saving him and everyone else, adding that there was nothing more he could say but thank you. The girl knew that was just a mini-boss and mentioned there was still one more, alarming everyone present. When the girl said that out loud, everyone started sweating nervously, and she tried to undo her mistake. The protagonist quickly covered her mouth with his hand, knowing that if she tried explaining, it would only get worse. He said he would share the details with everyone later. There was something else he needed to tell them first. Now came the story about Kara's and the direction things were heading. After achieving victory over the Sentinel using that weapon, he caught the attention of Hephaestus, whose chat name was Commander Green. In fact, he'd also attracted the attention of Anonymous 97, who noticed Hephaestus was using a different channel. Now everyone wanted to know who owned that avatar, but it didn't seem to belong to anyone, and they had no way of accessing information. They asked Jester if she knew anything since that stranger was always with her avatar. She replied that even if she knew, she wouldn't say. The conversation was quite thrilling and revolved around that mysterious figure. One of the manipulators was watching closely, thinking the more she looked, the more certain she was that he was exactly her type. Now the question was what they would do with the body. Returning to where the protagonist was, the girl wanted to know if there had been a drop. He confirmed there was, and she asked what it was. It was a grimoire, though it looked very much like an ordinary stone. That was a grimoire containing a rank A skill. If someone consumed this metal and used the skill, they'd transform part of their body into metal as well. It contained an ability called Starfish. The girl wondered if he ate Maurice, would he also transform into a sea urchin? She actually wouldn't find something like that easily, as it only dropped after defeating the Sentinel. The girl felt annoyed because it seemed like he was showing off. However, he simply tossed the stone towards her. She wanted to know why he threw something so precious into her hands. He said it would be more useful to her than to him. He explained that since she could already transform, she'd also be able to turn her hand into a weapon or metal. She wasn't sure if something like that would even work. He said she'd only know by trying. She wanted to confirm if it was really alright to give her the stone, as it would vanish after one use and seemed quite valuable. The protagonist replied it wasn't extremely valuable, though it was indeed quite rare. He found it amusing how modest she acted in this situation. She said she'd use it, and it would be pointless to ask for it back later since there were no returns. She was only accepting because he was giving it willingly. She tried to calm herself, placed the stone between her hands, and squeezed. Then she used the starfish ability. The protagonist thought perhaps he should have given that skill to her only if she wasn't an avatar, but it was unavoidable. When he looked at the girl, he felt her future might actually be worth investing a little effort into. Now the civilians were being instructed to quickly evacuate the area, as it had never been safe and would soon worsen. Everyone was leaving with the protagonist's help, who was breaking all the collars and keeping the servants safe. He had already done this for many people, and a long line was waiting to be freed. He asked them to hurry, as there were still many people left to free. Nana noticed he was so exhausted he looked more like a corpse. The protagonist scolded her, reminding her she was supposed to keep an eye on the body. She was worried about the stamps and wondered what would happen if they simply escaped. She thought it wasn't fair to leave with only 4 stamps. He reminded her it wasn't like she had gotten all 4 on her own. He wanted to finish the quest, so he called over one of those who hadn't been freed yet. He asked that person to stamp them. The guy stamped, thinking it probably wouldn't work like this. The girl also doubted it would work so easily but was surprised when it did. She wondered why she'd gone through so much trouble if completing the quest was actually this easy. There wasn't even a reward. It had been so easy that the quest was probably designed to give no reward. Though she felt disappointed, everything was okay now that she'd obtained all the stamps. They could easily complete everyone's quest while walking. Aside from his own mission, the third main mission, to save the people from the amusement park. However, in another location, the crow was annoyed because he couldn't find the mammoth, who hadn't shown up yet. Another animal appeared to explain something had happened to the sentinel, something they just discovered. After hesitating, he handed over the communicator. What was happening was greatly irritating the crow. Rafa began by saying that something unexpected had occurred. The crow assumed the giant had gone too far. After eliminating half the park visitors, he must have gotten so excited hearing that many would give up that he couldn't control himself. Duck bathe, bless. He said it wasn't what had happened. On the contrary, the sentinel was the one who had fallen. Everyone couldn't believe the nonsense they were hearing. It couldn't possibly be true. Sweating nervously, the rat insisted it was true. He confirmed it and was certain of the information he was giving. He demanded to know what those fools had been doing all this time without reporting to him. The rat explained he'd been dealing with players who had suddenly begun attacking them. Karis could barely believe what he was hearing, that mere humans were daring to challenge him. He ordered the monsters to assemble and eliminate everyone in the safari. That's when the rat mentioned another problem. Furious, Karis demanded to know what else he was talking about. He accused him of fearing mere humans. The rat explained the monsters had already surrounded the safari. However, according to them, the place was completely empty. These words extinguished any trace of joy Karis might have still been feeling. The protagonist knew he had now angered that bastard enough to finally make him show his face. Everyone was already leaving that horrible place. Chang, who had been a spy for a long time, noticed there was a group of injured people lagging behind. As soon as the protagonist arrived, Chang complained that he had taken too long, though he added that everything was going very well. The protagonist said that things would only be fine if everyone managed to leave safely. Both of them knew he was saying this because of the crow. It would definitely appear sooner or later. In fact, the two of them were already hearing a severe noise, and it could only be that person. A bad feeling overtook the whole place. It was the creature approaching. The protagonist became so angry he couldn't hold back. He himself would have to handle the situation now that the creature had arrived. Everyone was watching. The crow was extremely frightening because his reputation was terrible. The protagonist didn't expect the pressure to be so intense. From above, the crow was showing everyone that he was a star. He flew in front of them and wanted to congratulate everyone on their accomplishments. He wanted to know who had made him leave his throne. The protagonist, looking at him, knew he wouldn't be an easy opponent, but it had been a long time since he felt so nervous. This reminded him of when he'd encountered the organ during the second stage. That made him feel he could use it to his advantage, whereas the fight against Iron Ruler had been truly difficult. Even so, he wasn't scared. Rather, this time he was genuinely anxious. Perhaps it wasn't fear. It was more of a tension caused by having so many people depending on him. In his past life, he would have abandoned them all. But now it was different. He told everyone he'd hold off that monster while they escaped and urged them to hurry. Nina was making sure everyone moved as quickly as possible and didn't waste time. The crow asked if he really thought he would stand by quietly while everyone escaped. The protagonist arrogantly replied that if he thought that way, he'd use an ability called. The protagonist was finding it difficult to block, but despite that, he managed to deflect every attack. He couldn't believe that the crow was going all out right from the beginning. The crow also thought it was incredibly audacious for a mere human to speak to him like that. Then he enjoyed the splendid sight, astonished that a mere human would dare treat him that way. The protagonist knew the crow deserved that attitude since he'd stepped down from his throne just to handle a few people. However, the conversation was dragging on, and the crow was annoyed by having to listen to this unpleasant human barking. The protagonist was deliberately irritating the crow, needing only to buy some time since not even half the people had escaped yet. When he calculated how many were still left to safely leave that place, he concluded he'd need at least 30 minutes, though he knew it wouldn't be easy as the crow was about to attack again. Now the crow was observing carefully, looking for his prey to target. The hero needed to calm down, as his rival was superior in all abilities. With everything settled, he equipped the Jacket of Darkness and activated the skill Shadow Run. He needed that item to definitely stay alive and hit the crow. He had a very annoying skill, something the crow noticed right from the start. While the protagonist thought he could manage the others too, he used the Gloves of Darkness, granting him the Eagle Eye skill, a rank B ability. The crow was stunned when he realized he was being watched, even from that distance, and when the protagonist tried to attack, the crow couldn't believe the audacity of a mere human who thought he could hit him. The protagonist continued with his audacity, clenching his fist tightly to strike at the crow. Unable to believe such boldness, the crow flew upward, while below, the protagonist wondered what he was planning. Then the crow swooped down powerfully, slicing through even the rocks in his path with his sharp claws. Enraged by such arrogance, the crow furiously charged at the human, who kept dodging. At one point, the protagonist couldn't completely dodge, and the crow's claws grazed lightly across his face, causing a scratch. Realizing the fight wouldn't be easy, he jumped back to observe the crow's next move. Annoyed, the crow warned him that the previous attack wasn't meant as a greeting, but rather as a deadly strike. Upon hearing that, the protagonist felt even more relieved that he'd managed to dodge in time. However, the opponent announced he'd let him experience the rare torment of losing his sight, hoping it would cure his arrogance. The crow began changing his appearance, releasing a light from the palm of his hand. The protagonist knew this meant the crow was about to use that skill, which was completely different from what he'd anticipated. Aware of what he was about to do, he ordered the human to make sure he understood what was coming, so he'd remember later, once his useless eyes were gone. Losing his wings and gliding through the sky, he said that was the power of a star. He flew as high as he could with his black wings. From up there, he warned that he would show no mercy. He also wished him luck dodging the attack, because he was going to need it if he wanted to stay alive. The protagonist hadn't expected him to use that weapon so quickly. When the crow descended, he came flapping his wings, as if attacking 1,000 times and from every direction. With that attack, the protagonist felt it. He knew that if he didn't act fast, he would perish as the crow continued unleashing his strikes. All the protagonist could do until now, besides facing the pressure, was run and try to dodge the multiple blows. The crow noticed that his speed had suddenly increased. Now the protagonist was using Celestial Physique, a shared ability. All attributes were increased by 30% according to his energy. He wasn't even using his healing ability, which offered 50% faster recovery from total injuries. For now, he believed he could hold out only because of those two abilities at his side. He didn't think it would be a problem to buy some time. He figured everyone was almost at the exit. He just needed to hold on a bit longer. Meanwhile, the crow remained outraged. This was all happening because of a human. His body signaled that it would use a stronger power, and seeing all that energy gathering in his palm, he knew this was the moment. He was about to unleash his power, and there was nothing the protagonist could do. Things were spiraling out of control. He had to listen to that annoying crow brag about being superior to the human race just because he was a star. He also said he would show that insolent human his full attributes. The crow made it clear things wouldn't end here. He declared that everyone should leave now. He wouldn't hold back in eliminating them all, especially because he wasn't affected by the mission's restrictions. The protagonist was furious, thinking it was unfair that the crow could use the victory sweep ability in that place. The power was incredibly fast. The protagonist thought he wouldn't be able to dodge it by normal means, so he had to use Shadow Run in hopes of gaining better speed. Only then could he hide and think of a strategy. Now the crow was starting to feel impressed by the human, who was still breathing. Now with white wings, he flew back upward. He knew the human was not just anyone. That's why he kept intensifying his bursts of energy to hit a larger area. Looking all around, there didn't seem to be a single place unaffected by the attack. Now the crow was congratulating the protagonist, saying that although he was annoying at first, his effort was admirable. Being modest, the crow said the human should feel honored to receive so much praise from him. The protagonist reminded him that he wasn't the king of everything, just a star. But the crow was on another level and knew he was superior. He also told the protagonist to forget it. He wouldn't buy any more time. He said this while squeezing the protagonist's fragile neck. Now in the form of white feathers, he looked at the protagonist and said it would all end soon. He just needed to eliminate him, and then the others who had tried to flee. Still looking into his eyes, he said the end was coming. He would be merciful and grant him a painless death, even though he had said the opposite before. The protagonist thanked him and said he had some final words. Looking at the crow, he said he shouldn't be so careless. Just because he thought he had won didn't make it true. Meanwhile, notifications started to arrive. He had bought the time he needed. Everyone in the amusement park had escaped, and he had completed the 3rd mission. With that, his reward arrived. He could now buy a DLC pack from one of his lives. He could inherit any ability or item from his first life. He completed the transfer certificate. People didn't understand what he was talking about, but suddenly, everything began to glow. The crow was struck by a flash of light. Things were going so badly for him that he even coughed. The protagonist was disappointed. It was only a superficial wound. The crow had turned his body quickly, which made him miss the vital point. The power he chose was one that, when fighting a star, increased all of his attributes by 100% for 30 minutes. Now with that spear lodged in his side, the white crow realized he'd been hit and couldn't believe it. He wanted to know who that person was. Just an ordinary player who wasn't even an avatar. How could he have that much strength? The young man didn't care and kept watching. While the crowd talked too much, they said it had come to this point because of a mere human. Cursing the protagonist as an insect, the crow charged at him again, unwilling to accept defeat at his hands. The crow would bombard the human with his white feathers, which had now become sharp weapons. The protagonist twisted his body slightly, as if preparing for a precise strike. Meanwhile, in the air, the crow created a whirlwind of feathers to launch a powerful attack, and to defend against anything thrown at him. Yet the protagonist launched his spear once again. It sliced through the wind barrier surrounding the crow's body, protecting him. He warned the human he was being foolish. He thought he could be hit by a spear if it were simply thrown like that. While the protagonist remained below, only listening to it scrape against his claw, he thought he hadn't obtained water oil for nothing. With the power he had gained, he spotted an opening in the crow's movement. Once again, the spear struck the crow, now making him more impatient and nearly desperate. Hit in one of his wings, the crow fell. The protagonist knew he still hadn't pierced his heart. Now the crow lay on the ground, sweating and still cursing the protagonist, so furious that he clenched his talons, revealing his claws. Now the protagonist knew he needed a shield, and fast. Luckily, he had a powerful shield, because the crow was out of control, and the attack was absurd. The protagonist was struggling to hold the shield, constantly being attacked. He needed to act. If he didn't, it would be the end for him. Meanwhile, the crow looked down, preparing his next attack. Quickly, the protagonist managed to muster more strength and now could hold the shield while remaining on his feet. One question lingered in the crow's mind. How did a mere player have so much strength and access to that kind of item? But for the protagonist, it wasn't easy managing everything while trying to dodge the crazy crow's attacks. He was so confident now that he was even mocking the crow, asking how a so-called star could scream like that. After being struck by a mere human, the crow felt the survival instinct kicking in too. The desperate crow thought it could only be a bug. Meanwhile, the human slipped through every attack without being hit even once. Evil eyes moved toward the crow, who couldn't understand why a human was walking so calmly, especially since he was heading toward the mass where that cursed one had appeared. And how he left, no one knew. He paused on the crow's head, but the crow didn't stop attacking. He would defend himself until the very last moment. The more time passed, the angrier the crow became, and his attacks now resembled heavenly wings falling from the sky, trying to throw a punch at the human, wanting him gone. As a counter, the hero once again used Shadow Run to dodge the attack. Wounded and grumpy, the crow was growing more desperate by the second, but then made the mistake of getting too close. And now the protagonist was already wielding the same weapon he had used to eliminate Iron Roller, Hypatia, aimed directly at the crow, intending to use it on him as well. However, when the next attack came, the crow had formed a wall using his feathers as a shield. The shield was so strong that it shattered the weapon, and now the crow screamed that the protagonist was also unarmed. He mocked that earlier the protagonist was full of himself, and now he just looked ridiculous. But the protagonist widened his eyes with the clear intention of finishing the crow off right then and there. He charged upward, which filled the crow with dread, not knowing what to expect. The crow shouted that there was no way he could lose a fight in a one-on-one. It seemed the protagonist now wanted to settle things in close combat, and so he went all in against the crow, who didn't hesitate to grab his head and slant it hard into the ground. That made the crow drop his guard, feeling so pleased that he claimed to have squashed an insect. However, while the man was still speaking, he said the crow was pretty dumb for a bird. The expression on that bastard's face was pure joy as he held the protagonist with his large hands. But the protagonist continued, saying the crow had been careless once again. Of course, the crow didn't understand what he meant. Only when he realized a spear had been driven through his stomach did he understand what was being said. He thought that human had been arrogant to the very end, sacrificing himself to take out the crow. In a higher dimension, someone was watching the battle, and knew they couldn't report it as a bug. Because the person was an ally of the crow, and because of the crow, they had to let that person pass. The man with black hair and a crystal on his forehead thought that players should have been quietly playing. Now it had turned into a big problem since the crow had been eliminated by a human. The one watching the broadcast was Caters, the administrator of the South Korea server. He was now regretting having been too soft on that crow. He thought it could be fun, so he turned a blind eye for just 3 points. Since it was part of the star faction, he assumed it was fine, considering the crow was weak. He thought not many people would notice, since the crow wasn't famous, and decided to leave it be for now. He thought it was alright as long as he kept an eye on him in the future. He'd be careful and observing. He was notified by the system that a major update was starting. The main missions would now take place in open worlds, allowing players to freely take over guilds. This could easily be done through a new interface. It also triggered Mission 4. A hard boss would appear in each region, and players' contributions would increase when fighting against the boss. The villainous protagonist was looking forward to this open world. This was what he wanted. It felt like stepping into a new world. He wanted to understand what a guild and a raid boss were, since one would appear in 15 days, and he didn't get why it would take so long. As always, she was bombarding him with questions. He said it was probably because there were still a lot of people. In a place where Lena and the Wu and Chang brothers were, the protagonist was trying to recover. The genius had just fixed the items that had been damaged, but they wanted to be sure he could stand up. He looked at the jacket, now good as new again. He thought his injuries must have been pretty serious, since his healing skill had risen from F rank to E rank. He told Nina he was heading to a certain place. She pointed on the map and said there were 4 raids in that location. She knew she just had to accept it, because she never understood the things he did. She said that this time she wouldn't go. Meanwhile, they were being watched. The protagonist noticed and saw that Jaster was blatantly spectating them. He figured it was a stroke of luck that Kares used a move that blocked vision, a move called Dust Curtain, a mobility skill used to block sight with surrounding darkness. The protagonist, noticing that the observer was saying something to Nina, realized that her manipulator wanted her to go along. He said he'd make a proposal that would make things smoother. The girl raised an eyebrow. He said he'd also like to make the same offer to the Wu and Chan brothers. He invited the 3 of them to join his guild once he created it later. Everyone was a bit stunned by the invitation. Nina said she didn't like that kind of thing, and Chang thought he wouldn't be of any use. However, the younger brother wanted to join the protagonist's guild and asked his older brother why he was acting like that. The protagonist told Chang it was fine. He could talk to him like he talked to a brother. Meanwhile, he thought Song Wu would become the best craftsman, and the younger brother was a player almost equal to an avatar, on top of having a rare skill that gave him huge potential. The 2 brothers quickly accepted. The young girl accepted too, and afterward, asked when he was heading to that city. He said he was leaving right then. Now a place on a stairway is shown, where many people are getting on the subway. It was said that the train would go directly to Darjin Station, but inside the train, a warning was given. The Rising Moon Guild was going to raid the train. Then several people stood up with weapons in hand, causing many of the civilians to panic. When they saw those armed people, many of them started to run. Inside the train was Jisoo, calmly watching what was happening. The protagonist was also on the train, though in a different car. He thought something might have happened in the car behind. He could use the item he got as a reward. It was Hunter's Intuition, level E, used to locate a monster. He thought the approximate location was a bit vague, but eliminating the crow had been more than enough as a reward. Switching screens, he saw that he had become the new steel body. He received the crow oil skill and the dust curtain skill. 2 others were still locked. He was currently unable to use all the skills due to lack of divinity. He examined the crow eyes skill. It allowed him to create a small crow, which could be used for surveillance. Dust curtain ability. The user could hide in the darkness, but the protagonist had seen the crow use it and felt like there was more to it than that. He also thought that, at that moment, the most important thing wasn't the ability itself, but the capacity to receive divinity. Stretching, he considered it a bonus. If things kept going well, he'd be able to look through the witch's observer in Darjin. She was the witch who loved humanity and wanted everyone to perish for her, but also wished for everyone to live at the same time. It was even funny to say she had a positive opinion, but by now, he didn't know anything for sure anymore. He was thinking about taking a nap while he waited. Meanwhile, in the other train car, one of the thugs was running. He was saying something about rumors of a crazy woman. It was Jisoo who had gone insane and was now putting all of them in their place. The guys didn't think they'd be unlucky enough to run into her on the train, especially since a red aura glowed in her eyes. But unfortunately for him, luck wasn't on his side, and he had to cross paths with her. A terrible moment. She was grieving her parents' loss, and she definitely wouldn't spare any of them. Even though the man promised he wouldn't do anything else and begged her to let him go, she didn't seem like she would accept it. Furious, she wanted to know if she was really supposed to believe what he was saying. Both her reddened eyes and the hand reaching out toward him made it clear he was out of time. Finally, the train arrived at the station. The survivors rushed out as fast as they could, catching the protagonist's attention in the distance. However, when he saw his friend descending the stairs, he got a pretty good idea of what might have happened. She said that when she saw him get on the train, she started following him and would have gotten lost if not for that group window. She had something to do in that city. He thought it was strange she had tracked the location just because she didn't have a specific destination. He asked if she knew he'd been to Roma World, and she said yes, that she saw it while tracking his location. He wanted to know why she didn't show up earlier. He figured it would have been way easier to fight the crow if she'd been there. A bit awkward, she said she had wanted to go straight there, but a third mission came up just as she was on her way. And although it wasn't hard, it was really troublesome, which is why she was late. She'd been dealing with that mission. She said she went to that city to eliminate the boss of that radio station. The girl had already suspected it was something like that. He found it strange she didn't ask anything, like why did he go to that city? She said everything he did never needed questioning. She had simply gotten used to it. Even though he had spent some time with her, he still didn't know if she had a good or bad impression of him. Now he was going to tell her the whole plan while heading toward the city of dunes. Meanwhile, in Shenim, the observers were in full swing watching Nina, who apparently was alone. She was upset because the protagonist hadn't told her exactly where the Shurim boss was. She had the paper where he had written a few descriptions so she could easily find those too. Looking at that paper, she had no idea where to find a foreign blonde man and his daughter in the middle of such a huge city. To her, the paper didn't even feel like a proper clue, just a clumsy drawing. Seeing the situation, she thought it even looked like everyone had been killed by a monster attack. She was disappointed because she thought she had finally found something easy to handle. But she was about to be attacked by a huge wolf. She looked again and realized it was a werewolf. If she couldn't land a fatal blow, since they healed quickly, she'd be in serious trouble. That monster was terrifyingly strong, lifting something heavy and throwing it in her direction. But the commotion caught the attention of the father and daughter she'd been looking for. Their help was vital. It was dangerous to be in that area. She looked up and saw it was indeed a foreign guy and his daughter, just like the protagonist had drawn. She thanked him for the help, and the man said everyone should help one another, then immediately started showing off his new technique. He said it was called the stone spear. It was already embarrassing her. She was a young woman with long blonde hair and blue eyes. The daughter commented that the girl looked strong. With several observers surrounding her, the girl looked exactly like the drawing. Just to be sure, she asked their names. The man said he was Luke Taylor, and the little girl was Lynn. Those were the names given. It was pure luck she found them out of nowhere like that. She asked if she could follow them for a while, looking at the man's muscles and thinking he had to be a player. Looking at the young girl, she wasn't sure what exactly she was supposed to be. The man agreed to let the girl stay with them for a while, but the daughter didn't think it made sense to protect someone stronger than them. Nina knew that girl had to be something special, since the protagonist had asked her to walk alongside him if possible. Without wasting any time, she sent a message to the protagonist saying she had found the people he was looking for. She didn't know for sure, but she believed those people might lead humanity toward hope.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.